At 3:11 in the morning, a voice doubled the mana in 8 billion people and sorted us all into ranks, and the strong woke up twice as strong. My innate 2 became 4, the smallest number ever logged, stamped F where the whole world could read it. A starter party carried me along out of pity and laughed the run down, and they were still laughing when my 4 squared to 16 on its own, then to 256, and every dawn since, while my body changed into a stranger and I started soloing the dungeons the Apex could not finish. I keep every coin of it, and I hide all of it, because the system kills anyone who climbs past the rank it gave them, and the real number behind my name is the largest crime in the realm. Let me tell it the way it happened. From the morning I had nothing. The transport itself took no time I could measure. One breath I was on my side in a rented studio with the alarm not yet due. The next I was standing upright on packed gray ground under a sky the color of a healed bruise. And the only thing my body remembered of the journey was the way my stomach dropped when the floor changed. Thousands of people stood around me in the same loose shock, some still in night clothes, a man near me barefoot and gripping his own elbows, a woman turning a slow circle searching for a door that was not there. Then the voice came down over all of us at once, flat and unhurried. It told the world that the twofold decree had been applied, that our innate mana had been doubled a single time, and that the doubled value was now our permanent rank, fixed from this moment, F through S, and that survival probability for the gathered population was unrated. A panel opened in front of every set of eyes, mine included, and I read mine while my pulse hammered. It told me my innate mana had been 2 and that the decree had doubled it to 4. Public rank assigned, F, lowest recorded, public mana now locked. I stared at the 4 with the dull recognition of a man reading a diagnosis he had already half-priced, because I had spent 11 years as an insurance actuary putting numbers on exactly this kind of bad luck for other people. A 4 against a ladder that started at 100 for the next rank up was the floor of the floor. Around me the math was going the other way. A heavy-set man 2 paces off whooped and told the people near him that he had read 800, a solid D, and a teenager somewhere behind me kept repeating her own figure to herself. 6,000, almost a C, afraid to stop saying it. The strong had been handed a gift on the worst morning of their lives, and the weak had been handed a sentence, and the voice had read both in the same even tone. I did not cheer and I did not curse. Reading the fine print is the only thing I have ever been good at, so I read the rest of my panel. Below the locked 4 sat a second line the others around me did not seem to have. A line that told me an anomaly subroutine had engaged, that my real mana would square at each cycle and show on this private panel only, that growth beyond my allotted rank violated the decree ceiling, and that concealment was advised. I read that last word twice without meaning to, advised, and filed it somewhere I could not look at yet, because the population counter had appeared in the corner of the broadcast, and it had already started to fall. It fell the way water finds a crack, 8 billion and some odd millions when I first caught it, then a tick down, then a faster tick, and a live ledger scrolled beside it. Names with their stamps and last known zones, the dead going gray 1 row at a time. I did not need a name attached to understand what was thinning the count. People had been pulled out of their beds onto bare ground in a realm built to cull them, and the ones with the lowest numbers were finding out first what that meant. I am the lone wolf type, no one waiting on me in the old world and no one waiting here, so the ledger hit me as data rather than grief, and the data said the bottom of the rank table was being erased fastest, and I was the bottom of the bottom. The voice came back before I could decide anything. It told all newly stamped F and E ranks in my sector that we were to proceed to the sieve for orientation and assignment, and the ground answered the words, a wide funnel of the same gray stone opening ahead, and a soft pressure at my back that was not quite a wind, hurting. I went, because the people who refused to go were the next gray rows on the ledger. The sieve turned out to be a pit, a broad bowl of rock sunk into the plain with tiered ledges around its rim. A system marker hung over it that named it a starter culling ground, and told us the dead and dying below were our orientation. That we would learn the realm by surviving its shallow end or feeding it. Fodder in one word, and the funnel had sorted the fodder by stamp, so the men and women filing down beside me all wore F and E over their heads like the rest of us. A starter party formed at the lip the way they form everywhere. The strongest few drawing the desperate many. Theirs was led by a broad E rank with 110 mana who had appointed himself captain inside of a minute, and he was taking on bodies for a clearing run into the sieve's lower terrace, where the system promised a wardstone cache. He looked me over, read the 4 above my head, and his mouth did the thing I would see 100 more times that week. Speaking to the others rather than to me, he said the cache run wanted bodies to haul, and that the last tally here could at least carry, since a 4 could not do anything else. The party laughed, an easy group laugh at the dead weight, and a porter, already on a roster, a wiry older man with an E over his own head, and a frame built for hauling, caught my eye and gave me a small tired shrug that meant take the work. It beats the ledger. So I took the work. I told the captain I would carry, and I shouldered the empty hauling frame they handed me, and I went down into the pit as the bag mule of a party that had already decided my whole worth was 4. The lower terrace was a flat shelf of stones scattered with the wardstone cache the system had promised, and the things that guarded it. Knee-high gray crawlers with too many legs and a heavier shape moving behind them in the gloom. At the captain's call for formation, the two F rankers with real numbers under 100 took the front with the cheap iron the cash offered, and I was waved to the back with the porter in the frame to load whatever they cleared. For a while it went the way these things are supposed to go. The crawlers came in ones and twos, the front line put them down, and the porter and I scooped wardstones into the frame while the party congratulated itself on every easy kill. Then the heavier shape came out of the gloom, and the captain's count was wrong. It was a single bracer-armed husk, a head taller than any of us, an F minion by the marker over it but a high one, the kind the system had clearly seeded so the run would cost the party something. And it came in fast on the flank where only the porter and I stood. The captain shouted for the front line to wheel, and the front line was too slow, and the husk closed the last stride on the old porter with one arm already swinging, and the man got his hauling frame up and braced for a hit that would have folded him in half. I had time to think one cold thing, that the ledger was about to add a gray row an arm's length from me, and then my hands moved before the thought finished. My only weapon was the loading bar off my own frame, a length of dull iron meant for nothing but levering bags. Stepping past the porter, I swung it into the husk's bracered arm to turn the blow, and the bar should have rung off and snapped my wrists, because that is what 4 mana does against a high F minion. It loses. It did not lose. The iron met the husk, and the husk's arm broke the wrong way. The joint caved in with a wet crack, and the force that went up the bar into my shoulders was nothing. Less than the kick of a door. For half a breath I stood there as confused as the thing in front of me, and then I read what the marker would not show me, that my strike had not landed at 4. My panel had answered the swing with 16, the figure it had quietly squared to overnight while the board kept printing 4, and 16 against a high F was a man swatting a moth. None of the confusion reached my face. I reversed the bar and drove the pointed end up under the husk's jaw the way the porter would have if he could, and it dropped, and I stepped back into the deadweight slouch and let my mouth fall open in the dumb relief of a man who cannot believe his own luck. The captain reached us a beat late, took in the broken husk and the loading bar in the F rank's hands, and did exactly what I needed. He told the others that the deadweight had gotten one in by accident, a stuck swing into a soft joint, and that even a 4 trips into a kill once a year. The party laughed again, this time at the idea that the joke had fluked the husk. That old porter laughed loudest of all, because the alternative was admitting how close his own gray row had come. And he clapped me on the back and told the captain that, lucky or not, the kid had saved him a caving and he would vouch for the bags being lighter with the boy on them. Not one of them looked at the number. Nobody ever looks at the number when the man wearing it is stamped 4, and that, I understood, standing there with a husk cooling at my feet, was going to be the most valuable thing I owned. We finished the cash run on the captain's terms and his luck. I carried the wardstones up out of the sieve on a frame that felt like nothing to my filling out arms, and I split off from the party at the rim with a porter's thin cut of the hall and a new word over my head in the ledger's gossip. Lucky 4. Alone at last in the lee of a stone ridge, I opened the panel again. The public board read what it had read all day. Mana 4, rank F, locked. Below it, the private line read Mana 16, rank E, and a quiet note that the next cycle would resolve at dawn. 2 figures, one for the world and one for me. And the gap between them had just killed something the world said I could not touch. Dawn in the allotment is a paling of the bruised sky rather than a real sunrise, and the cycle resolved with it. I felt nothing in my body, no surge, no ache, just the panel ticking over while I sat against the ridge, the private line redrawing itself from 16 to 256, and the public board beside it printing 4. 4. 4, the way it would print 4 if I lived 1,000 years. For one night I had been an E on my own ledger, and the private rank read E still, because the thresholds are wide, and 256 is a deep E and nothing more. I made myself read the figure as a figure, 256, and I set my actuary's head to a column it would not finish, for 2 more days. 4, 16, 256. I did not name the curve yet because naming it too early is how people talk themselves into a comfort they cannot afford. But I wrote the 3 numbers down in the back of my mind and left the column open. The second day in the sieve sorted the survivors into a rough society, the way 3,000 frightened people always do, and my place in it was settled by the 4 over my head before I opened my mouth. By then the captain from the cash run had built his pity party into something larger and was hiring fodder out to clearing runs in the upper sieve, for a cut. He took me on again as a porter because the old man vouched for me a second time, and because a 4 costs nothing to feed and breaks nobody's heart if the husks get him. So I carried. Up and down the terraces I carried bags, while E ranks and the rare D took the kills. And I let my visible self stay the thin joke who had flooped 1 husk, and underneath the slouch I learned the realm by reading it, which is the only schooling I have ever trusted. I learned the rank table properly that day from the system markers and the guild criers who had set up at the sieve's rim. F was anything under 100 mana, the fodder floor, and most of the dead on the ledger had worn it. E started at 100, D at 1,000, C at 10,000, B at 100,000, A at 1,000,000, and S at 10 million. That top stamp belonged to exactly 10 people in the entire realm. The criers said the 10 largest doublings on the first morning, a closed apex that had never gained or lost a member because no stamp had ever moved. The criers spoke of the 10 the way the old world spoke of weather, a fixed condition you planned around and never argued with. I listened and did the arithmetic that no one else in the pit was doing, because no one else in the pit had a private line that read 256 against a public 4. The arithmetic said that if my 2 days held into a third, I would clear the whole E threshold before most of these people cleared their first guild contract. Mockery found its rhythm that second day, because a fixed society needs a bottom and the 4 made me the obvious one. By the second clearing, the captain's people had a running joke, that the last tally should be tariffed by the bag rather than the head, since a head worth 4 mana was not worth tallying, and a sharp-tongued E who fancied herself the party's wit, took to calling me F for free, the help you pay in scraps and laugh at for entertainment. I wore it. A man who has priced humiliation against death for a living knows which one to buy, and the joke cost me nothing I could not spare, while the slouch it bought me was worth more than the scraps. What it bought, I made sure, was a steady drip of small advantages, no one connected to the dead weight. I traded the wit her own clumsiness back to her as kindness, warning her off a husk nest one terrace up that I had read and she had not. She took the warning and kept the contempt, and from then on the party fed me the run's leftover wardstones to keep their lucky horseshoe of a porter from wandering off to a kinder roster. I let them think they were keeping me. What I was building was a stake out of their condescension, one wardstone at a time, and every stone banked the dead weight quietly into a purse the 4 said I could not own. The clearing run that morning took us up into a terrace the captain's scouts had marked as light, a few F minions and nothing heavier, and he let the weakest of his roster blood themselves on it for the experience, which meant the 2 true F rankers up front and me trailing with the frame. One of the front pair froze when a husk pup broke from a crevice at his hip, the cheap iron slipping in his hands, and the captain was a terrace away, shouting and useless. The pup was nothing, a low F minion the system used to teach reflexes, but the boy in front of it was a true F with a real 70 mana and a real chance of dying to it. And I was the only body in reach. I put the loading bar through the thing without breaking stride. One flat swing that should have staggered it, and instead bursted against the rock, 256 mana behind an iron bar dropping on a low F, with nothing left over for the thing to survive. The boy stared at the wet smear and then at me, and I gave him the dumb luck face again and told him, in the flat mutter the porters all used, that the pup had practically run onto the bar and he should mind his footing next time. He believed me because the 4 over my head made the truth impossible. The captain arrived, read the dead pup and the shaking F-ranker, and the dead weight who had somehow ended a husk pup with a bag bar, and decided out loud that the last tally had gotten lucky twice now, and that 2 flukes did not make a fighter, only a porter with a horseshoe somewhere unpleasant. They laughed. I let them, because the alternative to being laughed at is being measured, and the day I am measured in the sieve is the day a guild crier sends my name up a chain that ends somewhere I do not want it to end. So I carried the bags down, took my porter's cut, and said nothing. That night I started filling in the law I had only half understood from my own panel, because a guild crier at the Rim was selling it to anyone who would trade a wardstone for the telling. The crier's law was this, and the wardstone I spent on it was the best trade I made all week. Your stamp is fixed, he said, the double figure from the first morning, and nothing you do moves it. Not training, not relics, not kills, because the board only ever shows the day 1 number. But your real mana can grow, slowly, an E grinding toward the top of E over long months, and the system watches the gap between your real mana and your stamp through something the criers called the decree ceiling. Grow your true power a little past your stamp and the ceiling lets it slide, the crier said, since it forgives a hard grinding E who runs a hair over their threshold. Push far past your stamp though, climb where your stamp says you have no right to be, and the ceiling flags you, and then the cap auditors come, and the auditors do not fight you, they tithe you, they null your mana down to a clean 0, and they take whatever is left, which is to say they end you. He had seen it once, he claimed, a lucky D who pulled a relic and spiked himself up toward B in a week, flagged within days, gone within the hour, no body, no ledger row, just a name that stopped being anywhere. I gave him the wardstone and walked off into the dark at the Sieve's Rim, and sat with the worst arithmetic of my life. The crier had described a hard grinding E running a hair over a threshold, and that was not me. I was a stamped 4 whose real mana had multiplied 64 times in 2 nights, and showed no sign of stopping, and if the ceiling flagged a D who reached for B, it was going to do it soon. Everything in me that had spent 11 years pricing tail risk said the same flat thing. The rare catastrophic outcome is the only one that matters, and mine was certain and accelerating. So I made the only decision the numbers allowed, which was to hide. Never again would I let a swing read past what a lucky F could fake. I would carry bags and wear the joke and keep the gap between my real line and my public 4 buried so deep that no ceiling, no crier, no auditor would have a reason to look at the dead weight stamped at the bottom of the world. And then, sitting there building the cage I meant to live in, I turned over the one thing about my own panel that the crier's law could not explain, and it would not lie flat no matter how I pushed it. The ceiling flags growth past your stamp, and the auditors null the anomaly that trips it. That is the rule, clean and total, a system that corrects what climbs out of its assigned box. But my own private line on the first morning had not been flagged and had not been corrected. It had told me plainly that my real mana would square every cycle, uncapped, and in the same breath it had told me that growth beyond my rank violated the ceiling, and instead of stopping the violation it had built into me, it had advised me to conceal it. The system had not tried to fix the largest anomaly in the realm. It had coached me on hiding it. A machine that erases risers had looked at the biggest riser it would ever make, and quietly told it to keep its head down, and I could not think of a single honest reason a harvest would protect one of its own crimes. I did not have the shape of the answer yet. All I had was the wrongness of it, sitting cold in my chest beside the open column of 4, 16, 256, and I carried both into sleep. The fourth cycle resolved while I was still half in sleep, and this time I felt the panel before I read it, a small pressure behind my eyes that eased the moment I came fully awake. By morning, the private line had stopped being a number I could say in one piece. It read 4 billion and change, 10 digits where there had been 3 the morning before, 256 squaring up into a figure that filled the whole field, and the rank beside it no longer printed a letter at all. Only a flat note that my real mana stood past S with no threshold above its name. The public board read 4. I lay there in the gray pre-dawn, with the 2 figures side by side, the smallest stamp in the realm and a private pool that had just outrun every rank the system kept, and I finally let the actuary close the column I had left open for 2 days. 4, then 16, then 256, then 65,000 the day before, and now past 4 billion. I had pretended not to see it because seeing it meant believing it, but the pattern was the cleanest curve I had ever priced. Each morning's mana was the previous morning's mana multiplied by itself. The number squared, not doubled, the way the decree had doubled everyone once on the first morning, and then frozen them static, but squared. Every cycle, a compounding with no ceiling in it, and an actuary knows in his bones what an uncapped square does to a starting figure given a little time. It runs off the edge of any instrument you point at it. 8 billion people had been handed a single doubling and locked there forever, and I had been handed the one engine in the realm that never stops. And I had spent 2 days carrying their bags and apologizing for my luck. I noticed the body the same morning, because the panel was not the only thing that had quietly changed overnight. My face in the standing water at the rim cistern was not the gaunt thing it had been on the first day. The hollows under my cheekbones had filled. My color had come up from the gray of a man who has been losing, and when I flexed my hands, the tendons stood without the frailty I had worn my whole adult life. A crier had said it in passing, and I had not weighed it. In the allotment, a body matches its rank, because real mana reshapes the flesh that holds it, and the apex are tall and hard-built, and hard to look away from, while the F ranks stay thin and brittle. My real rank had crossed S in the night, and my flesh had started to follow it. The change was small still, a man who had eaten well after a hard month rather than a stranger. But I knew what it was, the way I knew the curve. Within a day or two, the thin joke stamped 4 was going to have a problem standing in front of anyone who had laughed at him. I needed somewhere to test the number where no one could read me doing it, and the Sieve's rim was thick with people, so I bought my way out of it. A guild crier was selling entry tokens to the low dungeons that ring the starter plane, and I traded the porter's cut I had been hoarding for a token to an E-rank dungeon called the Cinder Warren. A burning maze the criers rated as a hard solo for a healthy E, and a death for an F. I took it alone. A stamped 4 buying a solo E-token drew exactly the laugh you would expect from the crier, who told me cheerfully that the realm would refund nothing if the Warren cooked me, and I told him that was fair, and walked to the gate before my filling out frame could give him a second thing to notice. At the dungeon mouth, my panel did something it had not done before, and I knew without being told that I had earned it by walking up to a danger far above my stamp and meaning to clear it. The entry sigil over the gate, and not a burning script that to anyone else was decoration, unfolded itself into a reading only I could see. It gave me a clean preview of what waited past it, the Warren's true threat level, the count and rough strength of the things inside, the shape of the rooms, the temperature that would have boiled an F alive. The system named the new function for me in the private line. An entry sigil preview, my read on a dungeon's danger before I committed a single step past its gate. An actuary spends his life pricing risk he cannot see. The allotment had just handed me a function that priced it for me, at the door, before I paid. And I stood there a moment letting the gratitude settle, because for a man who means to clear watched ground that he has no rank to enter, knowing the danger before he is inside it is worth more than any blade. Inside, the Warren read as a healthy E's hard run, and it died as a low F's chore. Its maze breathed heat that should have cracked my skin, and I walked through it sweating no more than I would on a hot afternoon, because 4 billion mana shrugs off a furnace and barely notices the warmth. The minions came in the burning corridors the way the sigil had promised, cinder hounds and slag things that an E-party would have lost a member to. I put them down with the cheap iron I had carried in, and never once reached for more than a hair of my pool, because I was learning the throttle as I went, learning how little of the number I had to spend to make a kill read as an ordinary E's good day. The boss waited in the maze's heart, a thing of fused coals the size of a cart, the kind of fight the criers built whole parties around, and I have to be honest about the moment, because it was the first one in my life that mattered. I had been weak my whole existence, a thin man who priced other people's strength for a living, mocked on the first morning and mocked every morning since. Now I walked up to a dungeon boss that the strong respected and broke it apart with an effort that left me breathing easy, and for the length of that breath I felt strong. Truly strong, with no number to apologize for and no one to perform weakness in front of. Then I throttled the feeling down the way I throttled the strikes, because feeling strong is how careful men get seen. The Warren did try to kill me once, and I want it on the record, because a careful man does not let a clean run convince him he is safe. Deep in the burning maze, a collapse trap fired off a wall. The sigil had flagged amber rather than red. A slab of fused coal dropping where my old F-rank body would have been too slow to clear, and I caught it on a raised forearm without thinking. The slab broke against my arm and I felt the impact as a firm push and nothing worse. That is exactly the problem with a number that outgrows the danger, because the part of me that had been weak my whole life still flinched at a fallen wall, and the part of me that had crossed S did not need to. I made myself note the gap between the flinch and the truth, and file it, since the day I stop flinching is the day I start trusting the number in public, and trusting the number in public is the one mistake the ceiling is built to catch. So I kept the flinch. It would run the throttle for me, and I walked the rest of the Warren a man pretending to himself, the same way I would pretend to everyone else. I cleared the Cinder Warren and looted it alone, which is the part the criers never mention to the parties they sell tokens to. That a solo clear keeps every core, coin, and relic a guild would have split a dozen ways. The Warren's heart held a cache the system tiered as a tally cache, and it gave up a clutch of mana cores, a heat-warded relic an E-guild would have killed for, and enough loose coin that a porter who had been working for a thin cut suddenly had a stake. I bagged all of it onto my own frame, the one I had carried other men's wardstones on for 3 days, and I walked out of the gate past the same crier with the same deadweight slouch, and a haul that no F-rank had any business carrying. He assumed I had found it and run, and I let him. Back at the rim, I slept harder than I had since the first morning, the cash heavy under my arm, and the column finally closed in my head. 4 to 16 to 250, 6 to 65,000 to 4 billion, every figure the last one squared, every morning with the public board still reading 4, and the body in the cistern starting to belong to someone else. I woke on the 5th morning to a stranger sharing my body, and I knew it before I found a mirror, because the cycle had resolved past anything the panel could hold. The private line no longer tried to print a clean figure at all. It showed a 1 followed by a tail of digits so long the field truncated it, a number 19 places deep and climbing, and where the rank had read past S the day before, it now read only a flat note that no rank applied and no instrument in the realm was built to count this high. I had stopped being a man with a large number. What I had become was a number the system itself declined to write down, and the public board, faithful as ever, still printed 4. The body had finished what it started. I found a polished ward plate at a guild stall and used it for a mirror, and the man looking back was not last tally. He was lean and hard-built through the shoulders, his jaw clean, his frame carrying the easy weight of someone the apex would have nodded to in a corridor, and nothing in his face connected to the gaunt joke a starter party had laughed down into the sieve 4 days before. I stood there testing it, because a disguise you do not trust is worse than no disguise, and the realm tested it for me a moment later. The old porter from the cash run walked past the stall close enough to brush my arm, the same man who had vouched for the dead weight twice and clapped him on the back, and his eyes slid over me with no more weight than he gave the stall behind me, a handsome stranger and nothing more. So the first person who had ever known me looked straight through me, and the panel had handed me a second identity for free. I took it without a second thought, because a man who is going to spend the rest of his life hiding a crime needs 2 faces, and I had just been issued one that no instrument and no memory could tie to the registry. On the registry, I was still the thin F-rank nobody, man of 4, rank F, a name in the fodder rolls that no one would ever cross-reference against a tall freelancer in the field. In the field, I was an unknown the criers had no file on, and the two would never meet in anyone's mind, because the only thread between them was a truth that could not be spoken aloud without the speaker being tithed for knowing it. I changed nothing about how I dressed and everything about how I moved, and I walked out into the realm as someone else. The 5th day went to turning the engine into a fortune, because a number that cannot be printed is worthless until it is converted into things a board can read and respect. And the things a board respects are gear, gold, and a quiet reputation for clearing dungeons just above what the strong can manage. I bought solo tokens to the C-rank dungeons under my new face, and cleared them the way I had cleared the Warren, a few tiers below my real power. The wins read as the very good days of a strong unknown and never as the impossible runs of a god, since I throttled every strike down to the modest size of an ordinary excellent clear. C-rank dungeons are built for parties of practiced C-rankers, and I walked them alone, which meant every core, relic, and coin that a guild would have split 40 ways came up onto my frame hole. Then I bought a B-rank token, the kind a crier sells to an established B guild and never to a lone walker, and I cleared a B-rank dungeon by myself the same careful way, and the haul out of it was a small treasury. A man with a treasury and a crime to hide needs someone who launders rather than counts, and I found him the way you find that kind of man, by letting it be known in the gear black market that an unknown freelancer had clears to sell and no patience for guild politics. The broker who answered was a quiet operator with a dozen fronts across the safe zones, and he asked no questions worth refusing, only what cut and how fast. I told him fast, fair, and that I would blacklist him the day he tried to corner me, and he believed me, because the kind of men who say that are the kind who mean it. He moved my cores through one shell, my relics through another, my coin through a third, and what came back to me was clean gold and clean standing, and not one thread leading to the F rank in the fodder rolls. Inside of a single day, the poorest stamped man in the realm, the 4, the dead weight the 2-mana joke a starter party had laughed at, was quietly one of the richest people in the allotment, and not a soul on any board knew it. The conversion taught the system something, the way the solo e-clear had, and the panel unlocked a new function while the broker's first payout was still settling. It named the function Convert, and told me plainly what it did. The function let me spend raw mana directly into durable assets that no board could read, into gear, gold, standing stone, and warded constructs, value pulled out of a pool no instrument could measure, and set down as things a ledger merely listed without ever asking where they came from. For a man whose entire survival rested on the gap between a real figure and a public 4, Convert was the keystone because it turned the uncountable number into a wealth that left no trace back to the number. I understood as the function resolved that this was how the hiding would scale, not by spending less of the pool but by spending it into shapes the realm could not trace. At dusk I was crossing a market square in one of the safe zones. My haul converted and my new face easy in the crowd, when the one person in the realm who could undo all of it found me without trying. She was an appraiser, top-ranked, the kind the guilds pay in relics to read a man's true worth before they hire him, and I knew what she was the moment her gaze caught on me because her eyes did the thing no one else's had done in 5 days. They did not slide off. They stopped on me and held, reading past the stranger's face, past the easy carriage of a strong freelancer, past whatever throttle I had wrapped around the pool. And they read the figure underneath, the one the system would not print, the one 19 digits deep and climbing, and I watched the color leave her face in real time. She was Yoon Chae-young, though I would not have her name until later, and her talent reads a person's true mana through any stamp or throttle or changed face, which made her the single human alive who could see exactly what I was standing in a crowd pretending to be ordinary. For one long beat we looked at each other across the square, her reading the crime and me watching her read it, and every contingency I had priced ran at once. A shout, a crier, a name sent up a chain to the auditors. The gray row with my name on it. Then she did the one thing I had not priced. She closed her mouth, turned, and walked into the crowd, and she said nothing at all. I did not chase her, because a man who runs after the one witness who let him live teaches her that she should not have. Instead, I stood in the square and ran the new exposure the way I ran every other risk, cold and itemized. An appraiser of her rank did not work alone, which meant guilds paid her to read the worth of men before they hired or fought them, which meant she had every reason in the realm to sell a 4 whose true figure could not be printed, and she had not. A silence that cost the keeper nothing is cheap, and a silence that cost them a fortune is something else, and hers had cost her a fortune she chose not to collect. The broker, when I asked, gave me only her trade name and the warning that she answered to no guild outright, and read truer than any instrument the 10 owned. So I added her to the same shelf where I kept the system's advice to conceal, a kindness with no honest reason under it, pointing at a shape I still could not see, and I let her walk. I did not sleep much that night, and not because of the appraiser. She had seen the worst thing about me, and walked away from it, which made her a risk I could not control, and a mercy I could not explain, and I filed her the way I filed the system's advice to conceal, as a wrongness that pointed at something larger than I could see yet. What kept me up was simpler and colder, and it was that the engine had given me everything except the one thing I needed next, and to reach it I would have to walk straight back toward the only thing that could end me. The wealth and the clears had bought me the lower realm. Under the new face I could solo anything the criers gated up to be, keep all of it, launder it clean, and grow a quiet fortune the broker fed through a dozen fronts. And for a few days that had felt close to a real life. But the answers I wanted were not in the lower realm. The wrongness I had filed against sleep, the swearing that no harvest should protect, the reason behind a system that built its biggest crime and then taught it to stay quiet. None of that was sold by a crier or cached in a B-rank dungeon. Every piece of it sat behind rank, the way everything that matters in the allotment sits behind rank. And the broker, when I pressed him on where a man went for the realm's real secrets and its richest halls, told me what I already feared. They were inside the restricted dungeons, the A rank and the S rank, the deep ground the 10 gated and the guilds bled for. And those were not the lightly watched runs of the lower realm. The A rank and S rank dungeons were watched. The broker said watch the way the 10 guard their own treasury, by the auditors themselves. Over that ground the decree ceiling ran loudest, and the cap auditors kept their eyes on the rosters and the logs of every restricted clear. That was precisely where a hidden riser would have to go for anything worth hiding, and precisely where a single uncapped strike on the record would flag the ceiling and bring a sweep down inside the hour. I turned it every way an actuary turns a bad policy, and the answer would not change. Soloing an A-rank dungeon was nothing, a fraction of my pool in an afternoon. Surviving the solo was the impossible part, because a stamped 4 walking alone out of restricted ground that the 10 themselves clear in full parties would be the one anomaly the auditors existed to find, and the number they would pull off the logs would print to no instrument and would damn me on the spot. So I could not go in as myself, and I could not go in as the strong freelancer either, because no unranked unknown gets a solo token to watched ground no matter how clean his face or how heavy his purse. The restricted dungeons admitted only rank, only the rosters the guilds vouched for, only the named A&S parties the 10 allowed through the gate. There was exactly one way onto that ground that did not require a rank I could never be stamped. One slot on an A-rank roster that the system would let a man wearing F stand in. And the broker named it the way you name a thing you expect to be refused. porter, the baggage slot, the menial bottom of the roster, the hired hauler an arrogant A-rank party brings to carry the cores and the relics out, so the fighters never dirty their hands. It is the one position on a restricted raid that the gate would let a low-stamp body fill, because a porter is not counted as a clearer and never reads on the combat logs at all. He does not fight. Nothing he does registers as a strike. He is invisible to exactly the watch that would flag me, because the watch is built to read the people who matter, and a porter is the realm's word for a man who does not. The broker put the offer in front of me almost as a joke. An A-rank party out of one of the mid-guilds was hiring a baggage porter for a restricted run, and paying in scraps, and surely a freelancer with my clears had no use for hauling another man's bags. I had hauled another man's bags for 3 days in the sieve, while my real number outgrew the realm, and I had learned there that the most valuable thing a man stamped 4 can own is the certainty of everyone around him that he does not matter. The porter's slot was the same certainty, scaled up to the only ground I could not otherwise reach. I would walk into a watched A-rank dungeon as the bag mule of a party that would spend the whole run despising me. I would carry their cores on a frame the way I'd carried the captain's wardstones, and from the back of the roster, where no log reads and no auditor looks, I would quietly carry the entire raid. The fighters would take the credit and I would take the answers, and not one of them, not the party, not the gate, not the watch, would ever count the porter as anything but 4. So I went back to the broker before dawn and I took the line. The contract was a single page of guild boilerplate, the porter's terms spelled out small, no share of glory, half a share of the scraps, all the risk, and none of the rank, signed under the thin F-rank name on the registry because a porter is hired off the fodder rolls and never off the field. I read every line of it the way I read everything, and then I set my name to it. Im Sojai, stamped 4, dead weight. The guild crier stamped the roster and told me to be at the restricted gate by the next bell with my frame and my mouth shut, because the party did not like to be kept waiting by the help. I am standing at that gate now as I tell it. The A-rank party is gathered ahead of me in their good gear, loud and easy, already laughing about the run the way the captain's people laughed in the sieve. And not one of them has looked at the porter twice. Ahead of us, the restricted dungeon's mouth hangs open, a dark throat of worked stone with the auditor's watch held silent over it. And above the gate, the entry sigil is starting to unfold its reading for the only set of eyes in the party that can see it. Empty on my back, the frame weighs nothing at all. The 4 sits over my head where the whole world can read it, and I shoulder the bags and step toward the watch dark as the bag carrier who is about to carry the entire raid. The sigil over the restricted gate finished unfolding for my eyes alone, while the party was still laughing about the run, and it told me what we were walking into before any of them had a name for it. What it read as was a flooded vault. A drowned keep the old criers called the sunken tally. 3 submerged tiers of worked stone with the water rising and falling on a fixed cycle the system held to the beat. The threat count it printed for me was the kind of full A-rank party survives by losing a member or 2 on a bad day. Drowned wardens patrolled the corridors that flooded. Things groaned for the dark water with hooked arms and a patience that did not tire. Below the lowest tier, the sigil flagged a single heavier mark in amber rather than red. A vault keeper the size of a gatehouse that the roster would reach exhausted and ruined if it reached it at all. I read the whole shape of the run while the captain was still telling his fighters that the cores in the deep vault would pay for a season, and then I shouldered the empty frame and let my face go slack, because the only thing a porter is allowed to know is where to stand. The captain was an A-rank out of the mid-guild, a big man with $1 million and some change over his head, and the loud certainty that $1 million mana buys, and he ran his roster the way the captain in the sieve had run his, by deciding everyone's worth out loud before the work started. He looked at me once at the gate, read the 4, and told the others that the guild had sent the cheapest hauler on the rolls and that the last tally here should keep 3 paces back, keep the frame dry, and keep his mouth shut. A 4 in a flooded vault was 1 slip from being the run's first casualty, he said, and no loss if he was. The fighters laughed the easy group laugh, the one I had heard in the pit and would hear in every party I ever carried, and I gave them the dumb grateful nod of a man glad to be paid in scraps for the privilege of dying last. Then the gate took us, and the dry plain became a stone landing above black water, and the sunken tally closed over our heads. The first tier went the way the captain wanted it to, which is to say it went the way I quietly made it go from the back. Water sat low when we entered, ankle deep across the worked floor, and the drowned wardens came in 2s out of the flooded side passages the sigil had mapped for me, and the fighters up front met them with good gear and real skill, and put them down while I trailed with the frame and scooped the cores the kills dropped. For a while, there was nothing for me to do but carry, because a competent A-rank party against the shallow end of its own dungeon does not need a hidden god at its back. I let the run be theirs, because the day a porter starts saving a party that does not need saving is the day a sharp fighter starts to wonder why. So I carried, read the water, and waited for the place where the captain's count would be wrong, since the sigil had already shown me 3 rooms ahead where it would be. The water rose on its cycle as we went down, and on the second tier it came up past the knees, and then the waist, and the system's clock turned the corridors into a thing the party had not priced. A drowned warden in waist-deep water is a different animal than one on a dry floor. Faster below the surface, harder to read, and the fighters who had been carving the shallow end clean started taking the wardens a half-beat late. The captain shouted formations that the water swallowed. A B rank on his flank went under for a moment and came up cursing with a hooked arm raked down his side. And the run that had been a paid stroll turned into the kind of grind that cost the party bodies. I saw the first true death coming 3 strokes before it would have landed. A warden sliding under the surface on the far side of the wit. A shark-tongued woman the captain kept up front. The thing's hooked arm already drawing back to open her throat from below, where no one in the party could see it. So I dropped the frame against the wall, and I killed the warden. I did it the way the porter's slot let me do it, which is to say I did it as an accident. The corridor had a fallen wardstone pillar leaning where the water had undercut it. The sigil had it flagged amber, and a man hauling a frame through chest-deep water has every reason to stumble into a thing like that and knock it loose. I stumbled into it. The pillar came down across the spot where the warden was rising, a quarter ton of wet stone with the smallest fraction of my pool behind the shove that started it. And the warden folded under the slab with its hooked arm still drawing back at a throat it would never reach. To the party it read as exactly what I built it to read as. The dead weight blundering into a pillar and dropping it by dumb luck on a thing that happened to be under it. And the wit came around at the splash to find her killer crushed, and the last tally floundering in the water apologizing for being clumsy. She cursed me for nearly braining her with the falling stone, and she did not once think to ask why the stone had fallen the exact instant a warden was about to gut her, because nobody asks that question about a man stamped 4. The captain told me to mind my footing and stop dropping the architecture, and the run went on, and the party did not know it had just paid for its first save in a porter's clumsiness. That became the shape of the carry, and the knife edge of it was the watch. Every disguised kill had to read as an accident or a trap that misfired, or a warden that simply died, because the sunken tally was restricted ground and the auditors held their silent watch over its logs. The logs do not record a porter's stumble, but they do record a strike, and a single strike that registered at my real size would print a number to the watch that would bring a sweep down through the gate inside the hour, so I never struck. Pillars came down instead, stones the water had already undercut. I loosened, and let the water finish on the wardens I needed dead. The wardens I fouled in the wreck of their own flooded corridors, drowned in the architecture, killed without one of the kills ever reading as a kill. I throttled the small pushes that started the killing down so far below my pool that even Cheryong, had she been reading me then, would have had to look twice to catch it. Every save was a coin flip I rigged, and I rigged each one differently, because a porter who keeps dropping the exact pillar at the exact moment is a pattern, and a pattern is the second thing the watch reads after a strike. We reached the 3rd tier with the whole party alive, which the captain credited to himself in a speech to his own fighters, about the discipline of a guild roster, and the 3rd tier was where the water rose to the ceiling on its cycle, and the run became the kind of fight the criers built legends out of. The drowned wardens came in a pack here, 8 of them out of the dark flooded gallery the sigil had drawn for me, and they came while the water was high and the party was spent, and the captain's count, for the first time, broke entirely. He had read the gallery for 4 wardens, and there were 8, and 4 extra drowned wardens on an exhausted A-rank party in deep water is not a hard fight, it is a wipe. The kind the auditors note in their logs is a restricted run, that ate its roster. I had time to think one cold thing from the back, that the party that had laughed at the porter was about to become 8 gray rows on the ledger, and then I did the largest thing I had done yet, and I dressed it as the dungeon killing itself. The high water in the gallery was held up by the system's clock and by the worked stone that channeled it, and the worked stone had a keystone the sigil had marked, a floodgate older than the party's whole guild that held the gallery's water against the tier below. I went under in the chaos of the wardens, where a porter swept off his feet in a high water fight is the most ordinary thing in the dungeon, and I put a hand on the floodgate's keystone, and I let a thread of the pool pull it. The gate did not break. I made it look like it broke, like the old stone had simply failed under the pressure it had held for 100 cycles, and the gallery emptied itself in one roaring fall into the tier below. And the 8 wardens went with the water, hauled off their prey and smashed down through the drowned architecture into the dark. The party was thrown against the high wall and held there by the same draining flood, soaked and battered, entirely alive, and when the water settled to the ankle depth of a drained gallery the captain stood up in the wreck and read the whole thing as the dungeon's own structure failing at the luckiest possible moment. He told his fighters that the old realms built their vaults to drown intruders, and sometimes drown themselves instead, and the fighters laughed the shaky laugh of people who have just not died. The porter was face down in the shallows, coughing up water with an empty frame floating beside him, the picture of a man who had survived the flood by accident the same as they had. Not one of them looked for the hand on the keystone. Nobody ever looks for the hand when the man attached to it is stamped 4, and from the floor of the drained gallery, soaked and counted as luckiest of all, I understood that the carry was going to work exactly as well as the certainty of my own worthlessness held, which was perfectly. The vault keeper waited in the deep vault past the drained gallery, the heavy amber mark the sigil had shown me at the gate. Reaching it, the party was ruined in the way the run was built to ruin it. Low on gear and lower on nerve, the captain still loud but his fighters quiet in the way fighters go quiet, when they have counted the survivors twice. That keeper was a thing of vault stone and chain grown into the shape of a gatehouse, slow and enormous, the kind of boss an A-rank party clears by feeding it 3 fighters, while a 4th finds the seam in its armor. The captain formed his exhausted roster up to do exactly that, to spend bodies he could not spare buying time for a scene he might not find. I watched him price a fight he was going to lose, and I made a decision that a porter is not supposed to be able to make, which was that the party would not spend a single body. A party that loses fighters to a boss the porter could have killed is a party that limps out short-handed and talks at the rim about a hard run, and a hard run draws the kind of attention I was carrying these bags to avoid. They had to walk out unhurt and bored, certain that their own discipline had carried the day, and for that the keeper had to die without the porter ever touching it. So I gave it to the architecture again, and I made the architecture a fleece. The vault keeper held the deep vault's only hoard behind its bulk, a tiered cache the system rated as it rates the heart of an A-rank run, and their captain wanted the seam in its armor because the seam was the only way the criers had ever taught anyone to kill the thing. I had read a better way off the sigil at the gate. The keeper was anchored to the vault floor by the same flood channels that ran the whole dungeon, and the flood channels answered the system's clock, and the clock was about to bring the water back up on its cycle, in a vault built to drown what stood in it. I waited for the captain to commit his fighters to the seam, and I waited for the water to start its rise, and then from the back, fouling with the frame, I jammed the vault's drain with a slab, the careless fumble of a hauler stumbling into a thing he should not be near. The vault did not empty on its cycle. It filled, fast, the way the gallery had filled before I drained it. The vault keeper, anchored to the floor by its own flood channels, could not climb out of a vault that was supposed to drain, and instead drowned in its own chamber, the chains that held it to the floor holding it under while the water closed over the gatehouse of its skull. Treading the rising water at the chamber's high edge, the party watched the boss they had braced to bleed for go still beneath the surface, and the captain read it as the dungeon's clock turning against its own guardian, a bad cycle for the keeper and a gift for the roster. He laughed for the first time since the gallery and told his fighters that the realm's old vaults were too clever by half and drowned their own dogs. What he did not read, what no one in the party read, was that the porter who had jammed the drain by accident was the same accident that had dropped the pillar and failed the floodgate. The run they were about to walk out of, calling a clean A-rank clear, had been cleared end to end by the man they paid in scraps. Water settled across the chamber. Below it, the drowned keeper sank to the vault floor and dissolved into the cores and relics an A-rank heart gives up, and the cache behind it opened and the captain's fighters waded in to gather a season's pay, while the captain stood over them, taking the credit for a discipline that had killed nothing. I stood at the back with the empty frame and let them load me, because the porter carries the haul out. As they piled the cores and the relics onto my frame, I was the only one in the chamber who knew that every core on it was loot the party had not earned, undivided by any fight they had actually won, and that a measured share of it would never reach the guild at all. That was the fleece, and it was clean, because a porter handles every core that leaves a restricted vault, and a captain too proud to count bags is a captain who does not notice the bags being light. I had banked the cash from the Cinder Warren, and the C&B clears through the broker already, but a porter's cut of an A-rank run is scraps by contract, and scraps do not build the thing I was building, so I built it out of the carry instead. On the climb back up through the drained tiers, I converted as I hauled. A thread of the pool turning select cores on the frame into their own near-perfect duplicates that read clean to any guild appraiser short of Cheryong. I set the duplicates into the haul and slid the true cores into the warded fold that Convert had given me, the fold no board could read. The party walked out of the sunken tally with a full frame of cores and a captain's certainty that every core on it was theirs, and they were wrong by exactly the margin I had decided they would be wrong. That night, the broker met me at a black market front 2 safe zones over and turned the true cores into clean gold that no ledger could trace to a porter, a freelancer, or a 4. A run that paid me scraps on paper paid me a fortune in the fold, and not one line of it read anywhere but in the count I kept in my own head. The legend started after the 3rd run, because the realm builds legends the way it builds everything. Out of patterns the watch can read, and the truth cannot reach. I took the porter slot on 3 more restricted parties, out of 3 more mid-guilds, because the answers I wanted were spread across more than one watched vault, and because a man who is good and cheap at a thankless job gets hired again. Each party walked out of its dungeon intact and bored, certain of its own genius, and went back to the rim and talked. The talk found a shape that the criers picked up and sold. Certain restricted runs had been going strangely lucky of late, the rumor ran, the deep vaults drowning their own guardians and failing their own floodgates at the exact moments that saved the parties inside them. A rash of A-rank dungeons simply kinder than their ratings for no reason anyone could name. They called it a phantom carry, a streak of luck that followed the rosters, and the guilds argued about whether the old realm's dungeons decayed on a cycle that made them softer, or whether some new relic in circulation was fouling the watched ground. Not one crier and not one guild ever set the phantom carry beside the porter who had been on every roster it followed, because the porter was stamped 4, and 4 does not carry anything. I listened to them build a ghost out of my work at the Rim, and I kept my mouth shut and my frame ready, and I let the realm believe in a haunting rather than a man, since a haunting is the one thing the auditors cannot tithe. On the fifth of those runs, the captain made a sport of me, which I had learned to welcome, because a captain who was laughing at the porter is a captain who was not counting him. He was a vain A rank who liked an audience, and at the gate he told his fighters that the guild kept sending him a four to carry the bags as a joke, that the last tally here would slow them in the deep water and feed the first warden that got bored of the real meat. The fighters gave him the easy group laugh, and one of them flicked a wardstone at my chest and told me to practice catching, since carrying was the only catching a four would ever do. I caught it and fumbled it back into the strapping and gave them the dumb grateful grin, because the grin is the whole of the disguise, and the grin costs nothing. Down in the dungeon, a drowned vault of the same sort as the sunken tally, he kept the sport going through the first 2 tiers, narrating my clumsiness to his fighters whenever I stumbled. The more he narrated, the freer my hands were, because a man being watched as a joke is a man whose every motion is read as a pratfall. So I let him have his joke, and I cleared his run from inside it. On the 3rd tier, a warden came up under him in the deep water where his own fighters could not see it, the hooked arm already drawing back at the soft place below his ribs, and the captain who had spent the run mocking the dead weight was one breath from being the run's first gray row. I dropped the wardstone he had thrown at me, the same stone, into the channel beside him, fouling the warden's track with a porter's careless spill, and the architecture took the warden as it always took them. He came around at the splash, found his killer crushed in the channel, and the 4 floundering in the water apologizing for dropping a stone near him, and he cursed me for nearly braining him with my clumsiness, and never once thought to thank the clumsiness for the breath he was still drawing. At the rim that night, he told the story of the run as his own narrow genius, the captain who read the deep water and survived a warden that almost had him. The porter he had laughed at carried the bags out and banked another fortune through the broker, and the man who had been saved was the one in the realm most certain he had saved himself. One run nearly came apart, and it came apart on a fighter, not the watch, which is the part of carrying I had priced lowest and should have priced highest. The party was out of a sharper guild than the rest, and its second was a lean A-rank duelist who had survived more restricted runs than the captain, and carried the wariness that survival teaches. Somewhere in the 2nd tier of a clockwork gauntlet of a dungeon, a dry one for once, all gears and falling blades on the system's clock instead of water, the duelist started watching the porter. I had killed a gear warden by fouling its track with a dropped frame bar, a clean accident, and the duelist had been turned the wrong way to see the accident and the right way to see the result. What he saw was a gear warden dead, with no fighter near it, and the deadweight porter rising from a stumble a little too smoothly for a man stamped 4 in a dungeon that 8 F ranks. He did not say it to the captain, because a duelist who has survived this long does not hand a half-formed suspicion to a loud captain who will laugh it into nothing. But he started keeping me in the corner of his eye, and a porter being kept in a duelist's eye is a porter 1 save away from being measured. So I smothered it, and I smothered it by being worse at the job than I was. I let the next 2 gear wardens come closer to the party than I needed to before the architecture killed them. I let a falling blade clip my own frame and take half the hull down a gear shaft. The clumsy 4 I played loudly enough that the duelist's half-suspicion had to weigh a man who had just cost the party loot against a man who was secretly clearing the run. Clumsy and costly won, because clumsy and costly is the whole of what 4 amounts to. The duelist stopped watching me by the 3rd tier. I had bought his certainty back the only way it can be bought, by performing the worthlessness the stamp promised, and I walked out of the gauntlet that night having nearly been seen and having spent a real share of the haul to not be. The loss I counted cheap, because the day a duelist measures the porter is the day the porter ends. She was on the next roster, and I read her before I read the run, because the appraiser standing with a party at a restricted gate is the one variable no sigil prints. The guild had hired an appraiser onto the raid to value the deep cash before the captain split it, which is what the richest guilds do on the deepest runs. Their reader was the woman from the market square, Yoon Cheong, the top-ranked appraiser whose eyes had stopped on me in the crowd and held. I felt the whole carry go thin the instant I placed her at the gate, because every save I had dressed as an accident in front of fighters, captains, and a wary duelist had worked on exactly the principle that no one in the party could see the porter's real number. Here was the one human alive who could see it, standing 8 feet from me with a contract to read everything the run produced. Shouldering the frame, I gave the captain the slack-faced nod, and across the gate she caught my eye for half a beat, and the color did not leave her face this time, because she had already spent the first time learning what I was. She looked at the 4 over my head, and she looked at the porter under it, and she turned to the captain and told him in the flat report of a hired appraiser that the hauler was sound and the roster was clear to enter. Nothing about the number that filled her sight passed her lips, and the gate took us in. She kept the secret again, and she kept it actively, which is a different thing than keeping it the first time. In the market square, her silence had cost her nothing but the bounty she chose not to collect. On the roster, her silence cost her the appraisal she had been hired to give, because an honest appraiser reads the whole party and reports what she reads. An appraiser who looks at a porter carrying an uncountable pool and tells the captain the hauler is sound is an appraiser lying to her own employer to cover a stranger's crime. I carried the run the way I carried the others, drowning a thing here, fouling a thing there, killing without a strike, and the whole time I worked I was aware of her at the party's flank, reading the cores I handled and the wardens that died near me. The whole time she read me she said nothing, and twice she did more than nothing. When a young fighter in the party turned at the wrong moment and nearly caught the porter rising too cleanly from a kill, She drew the fighter's eye to a cash reading she announced a half-beat early, and the fighter turned to her and away from me, and the moment passed. Later, when the captain counted his haul and started to wonder aloud why the deep cache had read lighter than the guild scouts had promised, she gave him a flat appraiser's explanation about the realm's old vaults and decayed cores that sent his suspicion to the architecture instead of the bags. The fleece held where no fighter could have held it. She was covering me from the one angle no accident could cover, the angle of a man who actually understood what he was looking at, and she was doing it without a word passed between us, because a word passed between us was the thread the watch could pull. We came to an understanding on that run without ever stating one, which is the only kind of understanding a man in my position can afford. On the descent through the dungeon's lower tier, she fell into step near the frame for a moment, close enough to speak under the noise of the water, and she did not speak about the number. She told me instead, in the clip report of an appraiser noting a hazard, that the Captain's Guild had paid for 2 appraisers on this run, and that the second was an auditor's man planted to read the rosters of restricted clears. That man had been pulled at the last bell and would be on the next roster the guild fielded, so the porter should sell his contract before then and take the bell after. It was a warning, delivered as a hazard report, and it was the most valuable thing anyone had handed me since the crier sold me the law, because it meant she was not only keeping my secret, she was reading the watch on my behalf. An appraiser who reads true mana reads the auditor's planted men the same way she reads a hidden riser. I told her, in the flat mutter of a porter reporting a load, that the frame would not be on the next roster, and she gave me the smallest nod a person can give and stepped back to the captain's flank. The partnership was struck in 2 hazard reports, and a nod no name to it, and no declaration, because a declaration was a thing the watch could hear. What grew between us after that grew the only way it could, in shared risk and never in a word, and I will report it plainly, because the alternative is to dress it up into something the watch could read off my face. We took 3 more restricted runs on the same rosters across the next stretch of bells, the guilds pairing their top appraiser with the cheap reliable hauler often enough that the pairing stopped being a coincidence. On each run she read the watch for me and I cleared the dungeon for the party, and between us we walked 4 parties out of 4 restricted vaults unharmed and bored, certain of their own genius. She learned the throttle I kept and started timing her early cash readings to the exact half-beats I needed them. I learned the tells she gave when an auditor's planted man was on a roster, a particular flatness she put into her report of a party's strength when the party held a watcher she could read and I could not. We never met outside the gates, and never spoke of the number. Once, at the rim after the third of those runs, she passed close enough to set a folded slip into the frame's strapping without breaking stride, and the slip held the trade names of the 2 guilds the auditors had planted men in that bell. She was 3 paces gone before I had it open, and that was the whole of it, a slip in the strapping and a back walking into the crowd. I understood standing there that I was no longer hiding alone, and that being not alone was the most dangerous and the most valuable thing that had happened to me since the first morning. The unlock came on the run where the carry nearly killed itself, and it came because she made the cover possible. This dungeon was a deep one, a collapsing reliquary of a vault, where the system's clock brought the ceilings down tier by tier, and on the lowest tier, the party meant a thing the sigil had read for me at the gate, a reliquary warden the size of the Deepkeeper, in a chamber the clock was about to bring down. Nobody among the fighters could kill the warden before the ceiling fell, which meant they died in the collapse, which meant a restricted run that ate its whole roster and brought the watch down to read why. The only way to save them was a strike, a real one large enough to put the warden down before the clock finished, and a real strike on restricted ground prints to the watch and ends me. So I needed the strike, and I needed the strike to read as the collapse, and a single strike cannot read as a falling ceiling, because a falling ceiling is 100 separate impacts, and a strike is 1. I needed 100 of myself. The one true strike had to drown in a flood of throwaway force so wide that no instrument could pull my number out of the noise. As the thought finished, with the warden rising and the ceiling cracking and Chaeryeong already turning the fighter's eyes to the wrong wall, the panel answered me with a new function as it answered every need I had grown into. It named the function Conjure Surplus, and it told me what it did in the flat language the system used for everything, that I could spend the pool into throwaway constructs by the 1,000 crude expendable things conjured and discarded faster than any board could count them. Force without a name. The pool was deep enough that wasting 1,000 constructs cost me nothing I would ever feel. I conjured them in the cracking dark, a flood of crude stone fists that I made, threw, and let fail by the 100. Inside the storm of them I buried the one true strike that killed the reliquary warden, so that the warden went down not under a single readable blow but under 100 nameless impacts in the exact instant the ceiling came down. The watch reading the chamber's logs saw a collapse, a roster caught in a falling vault that lost its guardian to the same stone that nearly took the party. Chaeryeong, who could read the truth of it through any noise, was the one set of eyes in the realm that knew the collapse had a hand in it, and she gave the captain her flat appraiser's report that the reliquary had fallen on its own clock and taken its warden with it. The captain crawled out of the rubble counting his survivors and calling it the unluckiest lucky run of his career. I crawled out with the party, coated in stone dust, the frame half crushed and the hull scattered, and a porter's worthless luck the only explanation anyone reached for. At the gate she passed me without a word, and read me once, top to bottom, the way she had in the market square, and whatever she read in the new function in the wider pool behind it, she folded it away behind her appraiser's flat face, and walked out into the bells. I understood that the carry had just grown a tool wide enough to hide a god inside a falling roof, and that the only person who would ever know it was there had already decided not to say. The announcement came down over every set of eyes in the realm at once, the way the decree had come down on the first morning, and I read it standing at the rim, with the frame on my back, and felt the cold settle into me before the flat voice had finished. What the twofold decree authority announced was a mandatory re-rank assessment of the entire surviving population, to be conducted on a new instrument the broadcast called the Reckoner, and the line that turned the announcement from a nuisance into a sentence was the line that named what the Reckoner measured. A stamp from the first morning had measured the doubled value of a person's innate mana and frozen it. This new instrument, the voice said, measured a person's real mana as it stood now, the true present pool behind the frozen stamp, and every survivor in the realm would file through it and be read true, and the readings would be logged against the stamps. There would be no exemptions, no deferrals, and no way to decline, since a survivor who did not present at a Reckoner station by the closing bell would be read absent and flagged. The board over my head still printed 4. Behind it the pool was a 1 followed by a tail of digits the panel itself declined to write down, and the realm had just built a machine whose entire purpose was to read the second figure and set it beside the first. I priced it the way I price everything, cold and itemized, standing at the rim while the rest of the survivors broke into the noise of a population told to line up and be measured. For most of them, the Reckoner was a formality, and they knew it, because most of them were static at their day 1 pools. An E who had ground a hair past their stamp over long weeks would read a hair past it. A D who had pulled a relic would read a relic's worth above their stamp, small honest gaps that the decree ceiling forgave. The Reckoner would read the static masses near their first morning figures and lob them and wave them through, because the static masses were exactly what the decree had built, a population doubled once and frozen, and a machine that reads a frozen population finds a frozen population. None of that was what the Reckoner was built for. A machine is not built to find the thing it expects. It is built to find the thing it does not, the gap that should not exist, the survivor whose real pool has climbed so far past their stamp that no honest grinding or lucky relic could explain it. There was exactly one survivor in the realm whose real pool stood a number of places past their stamp that no instrument could write down, and he was the only one the Reckoner had been built to catch. She found me before the closing of the next bell, at a black market front where the broker kept a back room, and she came without the appraiser's flat face for the first time since the market square, because what she had to tell me did not fit behind it. Through the guild she contracted to, she had read the thing's commission, and she told me the Reckoner was not a re-rank, not really, that a re-rank was the cover and the catch was the purpose. The authority that had built it was not the decree office at all, but the cap auditors, who had commissioned an instrument to find a specific anomaly the ceiling had been flagging for weeks without being able to locate. For weeks now, she said, the auditors had known that something in the realm was climbing past every cap the decree set, and that the ceiling could see the climb but not the climber, because the climber was hidden behind a frozen 4 that no flag would ever read. Their answer was the Reckoner. A net dropped over the whole population to read every true pool at once, so the one figure the ceiling could feel and not find would finally print to a screen with a name beside it. In the plain words she did not usually spend, she told me the trap had been built to find exactly the thing I was hiding. There was no version of filing through it where the porter, the freelancer, and the 4 walked out unread, because the Reckoner read true and I could not be untrue in front of it. Skipping it was no escape either, since a survivor flagged absent met the same death by a slower gait. I worked the problem the only way it would work, which was to make the Reckoner read me as small as I could force it to read me, and I told her so. In the back room, the two of us speaking plainly because the broker's back room was the one place in the realm the watch did not reach. Every run since the sieve I had spent learning the throttle, learning how little of the pool I had to let out to make a kill read as an ordinary good day, learning to wrap the uncountable figures so tight that even she had to look twice to catch it. The throttle was the only tool I had against an instrument that read true. My plan was to present at a Reckoner station as the thin F rank from the registry, because the porter and the freelancer were faces, and the 4 was the name, and a name is what files through a re-rank. There I would throttle the pool down with everything I had, force the real figure to present as small as a stamped 4 could plausibly present, a 4 reading as a 4, the floor of the floor, an unremarkable fodder pool that the Reckoner would log and wave through with the rest of the static masses. Read and forgotten, I would walk out a 4 that read 4, the most boring number in the realm, and the auditor's net would close on a sea of static pools and find nothing in it worth a name. That was the plan, and it was the only plan, and I said it to her flat and certain in the broker's back room, and she did not answer it flat and certain. She told me the throttle would not be enough, and she told me why, and it was the why that I had been pricing low, and she had been pricing true. The throttle masks output. She said it makes a strike read smaller than the pool behind it. It makes a man spending a threat of a god's power read as a man spending all of an ease. And that was a fine tool against a kill on a combat log, because a combat log reads what you spend. This machine did not read what I spent. It read what I was. The thing reached into the pool itself and measured the whole of it, present in total, the standing figure and not the let-out fraction. And the throttle that masks the fraction I released does nothing to the pool the machine reaches into and weighs entire. She had read true pools her whole career, she said, and she had read mine 4 times, and she knew the difference between a man hiding what he spends and a man hiding what he is. And the reckoner asked the second question, and the second question had no throttle. I could force the let-out small. The pool I could not force small, because the pool was what I was, and the machine did not ask me to perform. It asked me to be measured, and a number that runs off the edge of any instrument does not stop running off the edge because the man carrying it wills it smaller at the door. I sat with that in the back room the way I had sat with the crier's law at the rim. An actuary handed the one-tail risk he could not price down. There was only one thing left to do, which was to throttle anyway, harder than I had ever throttled, with everything I had, and walk to the station meaning to force a 4 out of a god and knowing, the way I had known the curve, that the machine was built precisely to refuse the lie. The realm filed through the reckoner over 3 days, and I stood in the line on the 3rd because the line was the safest place to be invisible, a thin 4 among 10,000 4s, and I watched the machine read the static masses ahead of me, and log them and wave them through. It was a single tall instrument of dark metal at the center of a guild hall, a column with a reading plate at its face where each survivor laid a hand, and above the plate a long vertical display where the read figure climbed and settled. An auditor's clerk at a podium logged each settled figure against the stamp it belonged to. I watched it read an E who laid a hand, and the display climbed to 140, settled, and the clerk waved him on. Next to D who had pulled a relic, the display climbing past 1,000 to 1,200, and settling a small honest gap the clerk logged without a glance. The static masses read static. A double population frozen on the first morning laid their hands on the plate, and the machine read back the figure the decree had frozen, give or take an honest grind, and the line moved. Every settled figure that climbed and stopped told the same story the realm had told since the first morning. That no one rises, that the ladder is fixed, that the reckoner was a formality dropped over a population that had not changed since the decree froze it. I let the certainty of all those settling figures settle over me the way the slouch had always covered the 4, because a man hiding in a line wants the line to be bored, and the line was bored. And then it was my turn. From the moment I woke, I had throttled harder than I had ever held the pool, the whole of my will bent on forcing the uncountable figure down to the floor of the floor. 4 of 4 reading as a 4, the most boring number in the hall. Walking to the plate is the thin F rank from the registry, the stamp printing 4 over my head where the clerk could read it. I laid my hand on the reading plate and poured everything I had into being small, into being nothing, into being the dead weight the whole realm had agreed I was. I felt the reckoner reach past the throttle and into the pool the way she had said it would, not asking what I would spend but weighing what I was. The display above the plate caught the figure and started to climb. It climbed past 4 before my hand had settled, and it did not stop at 4. And the clerk at the podium glanced up from his log at the wrongness of it. Past 100, the throttle I had bent my whole will into screamed and held nothing, because there was nothing in the throttle that could make the pool small, only the let-out, and the machine was not reading the let-out. By 1,000, the clerk had stood up. The figure ran past 10,000, past 100,000, the display throwing its digits up the column faster than the eye could read them, and a quiet had started to spread back through the board line as the figure that was supposed to settle did not settle. On it went past 1,000,000, past the floor where the 10 stood, past 10 million, past the apex of the entire realm, and it did not slow because there was no honest figure at the top of the column for it to find, only a pool that ran off the edge of any instrument pointed at it. The reckoner had been pointed at the one pool in the realm that no instrument could hold. Its display filled. The digits ran up the column to the top, and there was no more column, no more places for the figure to climb into, and the figure was still climbing. And the machine stalled with its whole display lit and the figure pressing past the edge of it with nowhere left to go. Then it faulted. The reckoner threw a reading no operator in the realm had ever seen. The display going dark and printing in its place a single flat fault the clerk read aloud before he could stop himself. That the instrument could not resolve the pool. That the figure exceeded the instrument's capacity to count. That the reading was uncountable. An uncountable reading off the man stamped 4. The hall had gone fully silent around the faulted machine, and the clerk was staring at the 4 over my head, and at the dark display that could not hold what stood behind it. Some actuary's reflex in me priced the moment in the one cold instant I had left. Every contingency I had run since the first morning collapsing into the single one I had not been able to price down. The gap between the real line and the public 4 read out loud in a guild hall in front of the realm. I had spent 5 days and a dozen runs building a cage to keep this exact figure unread, and the machine the auditors built to find it had found it. There was no accident left to dress it as, no architecture to drown it in, no 1,000 constructs to bury it under, because the thing exposed was not a strike, it was me. The system did the impossible then, in front of the silent hall, and it did it to me. That same twofold decree authority which had frozen 8 billion stamps on the first morning and never moved one since. The law the criers spoke of as a fixed condition and the 10 stood at the top of as a thing nailed in place, took the uncountable reading off the faulted reckoner and it promoted me. A panel opened over my head where the whole hall could read it, and the 4 that had printed there for 5 days redrew itself. The public board overwriting its own frozen figure for the first time in the history of the realm, and it stamped me S. Not a high E, not a sudden A, but S. The apex stamp, the closed top of the ladder that exactly 10 people had worn since the first morning, and that no 11th had ever joined. The panel named it in the flat voice that named everything. That survivor Im Sojae, stamped F, was reassigned rank S by Reckoner assessment. The 11th S rank in the realm, by an uncountable reading. They had been 10 since the first morning because no stamp had ever moved, and the system had just moved 1, and it had moved the lowest stamp in the realm to the highest in a single fault, and the whole hall read it over my head at once. And in the reading the 3 of me became 1. The thin F rank last tally on the registry, the 4, the dead weight a starter party had laughed into the sieve. A handsome unknown freelancer the criers had no file on, who soloed dungeons a tier above the strong and kept all the loot. And the phantom carry the guilds whispered about, the luck that followed the rosters, the porter who walked 4 parties out of restricted vaults whole and was paid in scraps. For 5 days those had been 3 separate things in 3 separate minds, joined by a thread no one could say aloud, and the faulted reckoner cut the thread, and the 3 snapped into one man standing at the plate with an uncountable reading over his head, and the 11th S stamp printing where 4 had been. The true figure stayed dark on the faulted display, unprintable and secret, the way it had always been, because not even the reckoner could write it down. But the fact of it, the uncountable rise of the man stamped 4, was now lit over my head in a silent hall full of people who had laughed at the joke, and would never laugh at it again. The exposure unlocked the last function in the same instant it damned me, the way every function had come when I grew into the need for it, and this one came as the only answer to a pull read true. My panel named it Hollow Vault, and told me what it was, a hidden reserve folded out of the main pool and held where no instrument and no auditor could reach it. It was a portion of myself the reckoner could not have read even if it had not faulted, because it sat outside the figure the machine reached for, in a fold the realm had no plate to weigh. That faulted instrument had read everything I was, and Hollow Vault meant that from this instant there was a part of me the next instrument would not read at all. A true magnitude kept secret even now that the secret of my rising was lit. Over my head, a reserve no tithe could null because no auditor could find it. I felt it fold away inside me as the hall stared, the one piece of myself the realm would never measure. The system had exposed me to the world and hidden me from the world in the same breath, the same way it had advised me to conceal on the first morning instead of correcting what it built. That faulted reading did not stay in the hall. I felt it leave. The way you feel a thing the system does to you even when it happens somewhere your eyes cannot follow. The uncountable figure off the dark display lifted out of the reckoner and printed itself to a board that was not the public board, a private ledger the system kept that no survivor in the hall could see. At the podium the clerk felt it too, glancing down at his log as the entry wrote itself past his hand. Chaeryong, at the edge of the hall where she had filed through an hour before me and stayed, went still in the particular way she went still, when she read a thing the rest could not. Her eyes came to mine across the silent crowd, and told me, without a word, that the reading had gone somewhere worse than this hall. It printed to a ledger the criers had never sold the name of, a board the auditors kept for the anomalies the ceiling flagged and could not find. The system named the board in the entry as it wrote, the Warden's Index, and beside the 11th S stamp and the name Im Sojae, it set down the one word the reckoner had faulted on. Uncountable. And a man read it. I did not see his face and I did not need to, because I felt the entry settle into a hand that had been waiting weeks for it. The chief of the cap auditors, the one the broker had named only once and lowered his voice to name. He was Baek Gangto, the man who did not fight a manacap but nulled it, who had felt the ceiling flag a climber for weeks and never been able to find the climbing. The reckoner had found it for him. That one word uncountable sat on the Warden's Index beside an F rank stamp that was no longer F, and somewhere I could not follow, in the office of the man built to erase exactly what I was. Baek Gang to read the entry the ceiling could never hand him, and the machine finally had, and he marked the file. He claimed it off the index as his own to pull. The mark an auditor sets on a thing he means to keep. His name set against mine, the chief of the cap auditors, the 11th S, and the uncountable figure between them. Across the silent hall, Chaeryong's still face told me what I already felt settling cold into my chest. The carry was over, the porter, the freelancer, and the 4-1 man now lit in front of the realm, and the one-man tithing was built to end had just written my name into his own hand. The hall did not stay silent long, because a silent hall full of people who have just watched the impossible is a hall about to make noise, and the noise came down on me from every direction at once, before I had taken my hand off the dead plate. Up at the podium the clerk was still reading the fault aloud to himself, when the first guild crier broke for the doors. I understood from the back of my actuary's head what he was running to sell, the only fresh news the realm had carried since the first morning, A stamp had moved. The closed apex had taken an 11th, and the 4 everyone in the lower rolls had laughed at was now lit S over his own head with a word beside it. No instrument could write. The man who runs first sells highest. By the time I made the doors of the hall myself, walking the careful walk of a man who has nowhere to run to, the rim already knew, and the rim had turned to look at me as it had never once looked at the dead weight. I priced the next bell the way I price everything, standing in the open with the whole of my old cover burned off me, and the arithmetic was the worst I had run since the crier sold me the law. For 5 days my entire survival had rested on a single certainty, that no one looked at the number because the man wearing it was stamped 4, and the reckoner had taken that certainty and lit it on fire in front of the realm. Now everyone looked. The thin joke who could be laughed into the sieve and paid in scraps was gone, and in his place stood the one survivor in the history of the allotment who had risen a rank, the 11th S, the uncountable, and there was not a faction in the realm that did not want a piece of what that meant. I had spent every contingency I owned on staying unseen, and seen was the one outcome I had never built a cage for, because seen was supposed to be the end. They came at me in the order their hunger sorted them. The guilds came first, because a guild lives or dies on the strength it can field, and an unattached S is the richest hire in the realm. Within the bell I had recruiters at my elbow, with contracts already drawn, offering me a captaincy I had not asked for, a guild seat, a share of safe zone ground, terms that would have made the captain who paid me scraps choke. I read their faces as I had read the party captains in the flooded vaults, and under the flattery I read the same thing in all of them, that they did not want the man, they wanted the figure, the uncountable pool they could point at a rival guild's wall. To each of them, I said, in the flat refusal of a man who has learned to refuse without insulting, that I took no contracts and answered to no seat, and I watched the flattery curdle into the first calculation of how an S who would not be owned might be cornered instead. Then the 10 turned toward me, and I felt that before I saw any sign of it, the way I had felt the entry leave the hall. They had been 10 since the first morning, a closed apex nailed in place, the fixed condition the criers planned around and never argued with, and the system had just nailed an 11th chair to the top of their ladder, without asking them. I did not have to read a face to price what that meant to 10 people whose entire standing rested on the apex being closed. An 11th S unmade the one thing that made the 10 the 10. Whether they meant to fold me in, to weigh me, or to quietly see the 11th chair emptied before the realm grew used to it, I could not yet say. But I knew the shape of the attention, a cold measuring pressure from the top of the ladder that had never once measured the bottom. And I knew that a man the apex is measuring is a man one bad bell from being the apex's problem to solve. And under all of it, quieter than the guilds, and colder than the 10, the auditors turned toward me, because the auditors were the only ones in the realm who did not have to want anything. The guilds wanted a hire, and the 10 wanted their apex back. But the auditors wanted nothing. They only enforced, and what they enforced was the exact crime now lit over my head. Growth past your stamp is what the decree ceiling flags, and my stamp had moved from the floor to the top of the ladder in a single fault. And behind the new S stamp sat the word the reckoner could not count, the largest violation of the ceiling the realm had ever logged. I had read the law from a crier at the rim, and priced its tail risk certain on the first morning, and the tail risk had arrived. Somewhere I could not follow, the chief of the cap auditors held my name in his own hand, and the only question left on that ledger was the timing of the pull. I found Cheryong at the edge of the dispersing crowd, where she had filed through an hour before me and stayed to watch the fault, and she did not give me the appraiser's flat face this time either, because the flat face was a thing for the gates and the gates were behind us now. She read me once, top to bottom, the way she had in the market square and at every gate since, and whatever she saw in the burned cover and the lit stamp she folded away, and then she did the thing that had become the whole of our partnership. She gave me a hazard report instead of a comfort. In the clipped report of an appraiser noting a danger, she said that the recruiters and the 10's watchers and the guild criers were noise, that none of them moved fast enough to end a man in a bell, but that the one attention that did move that fast had already turned. I should not sleep 2 nights in the same safe zone, she said, because the man who had marked my file did not send recruiters. He sent a sweep, and the sweep did not announce itself. We walked out of the safe zone together without it reading us together, which is a thing she was better at than I was. In the lee of a stone ridge past the last of the criers, I made the decision that the burned cover forced on me, and I said it to her plainly because the ridge was empty, and the watch did not reach it. The hiding I had built was over, I told her, and there was no rebuilding it because you cannot unlight a stamp the whole realm has read, so I would stop hiding the wrong thing. Let them all know I was strong, since strong was lit over my head and no throttle would put it out, and let them chase the strength all they liked, because the crime lived elsewhere. The crime was the why. My uncountable figure, the one the reckoner had faulted on, was a thing the realm now knew existed. But the true magnitude of it, the one followed by a tail of digits the panel itself declined to write, stayed dark on the faulted display, and dark in the hollow vault the system had folded away from any plate. What I was, the squaring engine no harvest should have built and then coached to hide, stayed mine alone. I would hide that, harder than I had ever hidden the 4. The strength I would wear in the open, its reason I would bury where no reckoner could fault it loose. She heard the whole of it and answered it with the only question that mattered, which was where a man went to find the why when every recruiter in the realm wanted the strength, and the one man who could end him already held the file. I had been turning the same question since the back room before the reckoner, and the ridge was where I finally said the answer out loud. The why was an auditor's secret, I told her. That wrongness I had carried since the first morning, a system protecting the very anomaly it should have corrected, had a reason, and the reason was theirs. No crier sold it, and no guild knew it, and no dungeon cashed it, because the reason sat with the only faction in the realm that understood what the ceiling was actually for. The auditors knew. So did the man who had marked my file, and if the answer lived anywhere a man could reach it without walking into the chief auditor's own hand, it lived in the ground the auditors had already worked and left behind. The audited deadlands, the criers called the Quiet March. That was where the cap auditors had done their oldest work, and where the broker had once told me in a lowered voice, an auditor vault still stood over a stretch of land they had long since emptied of everything that could climb. She did not tell me it was reckless, because she had stopped pricing my decisions as reckless somewhere in the flooded vaults, and instead she did the thing that made the partnership worth the risk to her. She made the reckless thing survivable. The Quiet March was watched, she told me, the way all of the auditors' old ground was watched, but it was watched thin, by the standing eyes the auditors left on emptied land, rather than by the moving sweeps they sent at a marked man. And standing eyes, she could read. Her talent that saw a true pool through any stamp saw an auditor's planted watcher the same way it saw a hidden riser, and on ground watched by standing eyes instead of a moving sweep. An appraiser who could read the watchers before they read us, was the difference between a crossing and a gray row on the index. She would read the march for me, she said, as she had read the watch on every restricted roster, and I would cross it under her reading, and between her eyes and my pool we would reach the vault. Or we would not. But we would not be caught walking in. It was the same partnership struck in the flooded vaults, scaled up to the only ground that might hold the answer, no name to it, and no declaration, because a declaration was a thing the watch could hear. So we set out for the Quiet March before the next bell, the two of us, the 11th S that every faction in the realm had turned to look at, and the top appraiser who had lied to 4 guilds to keep him unread. We walked away from the safe zones and toward the audited deadlands, where the auditors had buried whatever a harvest does not want found. Over my head the new stamp printed S, where 4 had printed for 5 days, lit for the whole realm to read, and behind it in a fold, no plate could weigh the true figure ran on, squaring quietly through the night as it had squared since the first morning. I shouldered nothing this time, because the porter was burned with the rest of the cover and there were no bags left to carry. Out of the safe zone I walked as what I was, strong in the open and hiding the reason, toward the one faction that had the answer and the one place I might pull it loose without putting my name back into the chief auditor's hand. The Quiet March began where the safe zones ran out, at a line in the gray plane you could feel before you saw it, because the realm itself read differently on the far side of it. Behind us the ground hummed with the low pressure of mana as all the inhabited ground did, a million static pools breathing at once. And ahead of us that pressure simply stopped, an emptied flatness where nothing breathed at all. Cheryong stopped at the line and read across it the way she read a roster at a gate. She told me, in the clipped report she used for hazards, that the deadness was the point of the place. The march did not read empty because nothing had ever lived here, but because the auditors had emptied it, nulled every pool on it down to a clean 0, and left the land to go quiet over whatever they had buried under it. We were crossing audited ground, she said. Ground the tide had already passed over, and the thing to fear here was not what lived on it, but what watched it. And she set herself a half step ahead of me to read the watchers before they read us. Her eyes carried the crossing, not mine. I had spent 5 days learning to read a dungeon off a sigil and a party off a captain's mouth. But I could not read an auditor's planted watcher, because a watcher built to read pools sits outside the pool and reads in, and only a talent like hers read back the other way. So I walked the march half blind and trusting, which is a thing I had not done since the first morning, and she walked it reading. The first watcher she caught before I had any sense of it at all, a standing eye the auditors had left on a low rise of dead stone. She described it to me under her breath as a planted reader holding still on the dead land, set to wake and report the instant a pool of any size crossed its stretch. Off the line we had been walking she turned us, around the rise in a wide arc through the dead flats, and I felt nothing the whole time but the deadness of the ground. And the watcher behind us never woke, because the appraiser had read it before it could read the figure she was walking past it. The crossing taught me the shape of the places we went, as a sieve had taught me the realm, and the wrongness of it sat cold in my chest the deeper we went. Ruin is a thing that fell, and the Quiet March had not fallen. The march was a thing that had been emptied on purpose and kept emptied, the dead stone too even, the silence too clean, the whole stretch of it holding the particular stillness of ground that something tends. We passed the foundations of what might once have been a holdfast, the worked stone scoured down to its courses and knolled so thoroughly that even Cheryong read nothing off it, and past it a long low field of markers set into the flats in rows. She stopped at the field and went very quiet, the stillness that came over her when a reading ran deeper than she could say at once. Those markers were tithe marks, she told me at last, in the plain voice she did not usually spend, and no graves at all. One sat to a stretch, set where the auditors had nulled a pool down to 0 and noted the take, a ledger written into the land itself, and the field of them ran on past where either of us could see. I had priced the tithe as a thing that ended one riser at a time. The field said it ended them by the field. Watchers thickened as the vault drew near, as the husks had thickened toward the cache and the sieve, and the last stretch before it was the part of the crossing that nearly ended us. Cheryong caught 2 standing eyes set to cover each other on the approach, planted so that the arc around one walked us into the reed of the other, an auditor's habit of building a watch that punishes the obvious dodge, and there was no white arc that cleared both. So she did the thing she had done in the flooded vaults. She found the half-beat. She read the slow sweep of the second watch's attention as it turned across its stretch. A standing eye is not a moving sweep, but it is not blind in a fixed line either. Across the gap between the first watcher's edge and the second watcher's turn, she timed us. The two of us moving fast and low across a stretch of dead flat, where a single woken eye meant a sweep down on a march inside the bell. I felt the second watcher's attention pass behind us as we cleared its edge, a cold dragging weight that read the empty stone where we had just been. Then we were past it in the lee of the vault's own wall, and the watch was behind us, and the appraiser let out the smallest breath I had heard her spend. We had crossed the audited deadlands under the auditor's own eyes, and not one of them had woken, because I had crossed them blind and she had crossed them reading. The vault stood where the broker had said it stood, a squat block of auditor-work stone set into the dead flats with no gate I could see, and no sigil over it for my eyes to unfold, and that absence was the first thing that told me the carry would not save me here. Every dungeon I had cleared, every flooded vault I had drowned, had answered to mana in the end, a sigil that read to a pool, a flood channel a thread of the pool could pull, a warden 100 constructs could bury. This was auditor ground, and the auditor's whole craft was the nulling of mana, and the lock on their vault was built by the one faction in the realm that knew exactly how worthless a pool was against them. I laid a hand on the cold stone and reached for the seam as I had reached for 1,000 seams, and the stone read my reach and ate it. The thread of pool I sent into it nulled to a clean 0 against the lock as the march nulled the land. Pouring the whole uncountable figure at it would have changed nothing, the lock drinking every drop and holding, because the lock was a thing built so mana could not open it. So I stopped reaching with the pool and started thinking with the part of me that had priced bad policies for 11 years, and the answer was in the wrongness of the lock itself. A lock the auditors built to drink mana was a lock that assumed mana, a lock built by men so certain that power meant a pool that they had defended only against the pool. Cheryong read it with me, her hand beside mine on the stone, and she told me what her talent read in the lock's working. It was a nulling field set to clamp on any pool that touched it, and never to let go a snare that strangled the reaching hand, and it read nothing at all that was not a pool. Stone fell outside its reading entirely. Iron meant nothing to it. The patient pressure of a wedge and a lever was nothing to it either. The dull mechanical work a man with no mana at all might do to a seam-and-worked rock, because the men who built it had never once imagined that the thing coming for their vault would be anything but a pool to strangle. Perfect against power, the lock stood blind to leverage. So I would open it with leverage. I bought the tools, as the convert function let me buy anything, but I bought them carefully because convert spends the pool, and a spent thread of pool near an auditor lock is a thread the lock might taste. Spending the pool well back from the vault, out in the dead flats where Cheryong read no watcher, I converted a set of plain hardened wedges and a long iron pry bar, no weapon and no construct, durable assets a board would list as scrap, the dullest tools in the realm. I carried them to the lock cold, with no pool reaching ahead of them. Then I worked the seam the lock did not know to guard. I set the wedges into the hairline where the auditor stone met its own frame, and I drove them with the pry bar, and the force that went into the wedges was the plain force of a lever, and a man's weight on it. Mechanical and mana blind. Nothing for the nulling field to taste. The lock sat there drinking a pool that never came while the seam it could not read, widened under the wedges, stroke by stroke, until the worked stone gave along the hairline with a grind of rock on rock and the vault stood open. It had been opened by leverage, in front of a lock built to strangle power that had never learned to guard a wedge. The panel answered the open as it had answered every need I grew into, and this unlock came colder and more important than any function before it, because it was the first answer I had ever been handed to the one foe a pool could not touch. It named the function anti-audit, and it told me what it was in the flat language the system used for everything. I could spend the hoard, the laundered gold, and the converted assets the boards merely listed, into non-mana means against an audit, into leverage, tools, works that carried no pool for a nulling field to taste, the only kind of force that reached an auditor at all. It was groundwork and it said so, a first stone and not a finished wall. But I understood standing in the open vault what stone it was. The tithe nulled mana, and every weapon I owned was mana, and so against the man who held my file I had been, until this moment, a god with nothing in his hands. Anti-audit was the first thing I had ever owned that the tithe could not drink. The wedge had taught me the principle and the system had named it, and I stood in the cold mouth of the auditor vault knowing that the next time the chief of the cap auditors reached for my pool to null it, I would not need to defend the pool at all. I would defend it with the one kind of force the men who built the nulling field had been too certain to imagine, the dull mechanical leverage of a thing that carries no mana for them to take. Inside, The vault held a record where a treasury should have stood, the first thing that told me the auditors guarded a different kind of wealth than the guilds. The chamber held no cores, no relics, no gold, nothing the broker would have moved, only nulled stone with a standing ledger at its center, a tall reading board of the same dark metal the reckoner had worn, and a wall behind it scored top to bottom with the auditor's own working. I had cracked a vault expecting a hoard and found a record instead. A record kept by the faction that erased risers was worth more than any hoard in the realm, because it was the why, written down by the only hands that knew it, in the one place a man could read it without walking into the chief auditor's own hand. Chaeryeong went to the standing ledger and laid her reading on it as she laid it on a roster, and I went to the scored wall, and between her talent and my actuary's habit of reading the fine print no one else troubles to read, we took the chamber apart line by line. The first thing the ledger gave up unmade the story the whole realm had been told on the first morning, and it unmade it in a single cold line. In the auditor records, the allotment had a working name, and the name was Harvest. The flat broadcast that had doubled 8 billion pools and named us survivors of a culling realm had called itself a survival, a chance handed to a doomed population to live by climbing, and the ledger called it Harvest instead. We had been gathered into a realm built to fatten us and take us, the doubling on the first morning a seeding. 8 billion pools bred up a single notch, so there would be more to take. The whole apparatus of ranks, dungeons, the ceiling, the tithe was the machinery of a place that wanted us grown, and then gathered. I had priced the tithe as an enforcement, and the ceiling as a cage, and the ledger named them both for what they were, the tools of a take. The doubling was the bait, the ledger said, and Chaeryeong read me the working of it off the standing board while I read its proof off the scored wall, and the two readings closed on the same cold shape. A pool left to grow on its own is a pool that grows unevenly, some climbing fast and most not at all, and a harvest does not want uneven. A harvest wants a yield it can count, so the decree had doubled every pool once on the first morning to set a clean-seated floor under the whole population. 8 billion pools bred up a single even notch, and then it had frozen them there. The freeze was a method dressed as a law of the realm. A frozen population is a population that grows only where the harvest allows it to grow. In the dungeons and the runs the system meters out. Every pool's increase passing through ground the auditors watch and log, so that nothing fattens off the books and nothing climbs out of reach. The static masses I had watched file through the reckoner, the doubled population frozen on the first morning, were a crop the decree was growing on purpose, exactly as fast as a harvest wants its crop to grow, which is slowly, evenly, and under the eye. Then the ledger told me what the decree ceiling was actually for, and it was not what the crier had sold me at the rim, and the difference sat cold in my chest because I had built my whole survival on the crier's smaller truth. The crier had said the ceiling flagged growth past your stamp because the realm corrected what climbed out of its assigned box, an enforcement, a cage that kept the ladder fixed. By the ledger's account, the cage was a method too. A ceiling that capped each person did it not to keep the ladder fixed for its own sake, but to keep any single pool from ever growing large enough to matter, because a harvest fears one thing above all others, which is a yield that grows past the size of the harvester. Cap every pool low and even, and you have a crop you can take at your leisure. 8 billion small pools that no one of which is worth fearing. Let one pool climb without a cap and you have grown the one thing a harvest cannot afford, a pool large enough to be a weapon instead of a yield. So the ceiling flagged every climber the instant their pool reached for a size the harvest could not safely keep, and the auditors came, and the take did its work as inventory control. Out on the march the field of tithe marks stood as the cull record of a crop, no graveyard of criminals. Every pool that had grown a notch too large nulled back down to nothing before it could become a problem the harvester would have to fear. And then the ledger told me where the tithe went, and that was the line that turned the cold in my chest into something with a floor under it. I had thought the tithe an erasure, a pool nulled to zero and a man ended. The figure simply deleted off the board as the gray rose went gray on the ledger. The auditor working said otherwise, in the plain bookkeeping of men who kept accounts. A nulled pool was poured, not deleted. The tithe stripped a riser's mana down to a clean zero, and then harvested that mana, drew the whole of the nulled pool down out of the realm and poured it somewhere below, into a reckoning the ledger named only as the under account. Every cold riser's take routed down through the tithe marks into the dark beneath the march, and beneath, I understood, the whole inhabited realm. Out on the dead flats the field of marks was where the risers drained, not where they ended. Every pool the auditors had ever nulled, the lucky D who spiked toward B, the climbers the crier had watched vanish within the hour, the field of marks running on past sight, all of it had been poured down the same dark account, fed somewhere below by hands that kept the books on what they fed. Chaeryeong found the line that named the rest of it, and she read it to me off the standing ledger in the plain voice she did not usually spend, because what it said did not fit behind the appraiser's flat face. The auditor working did not name what the under account fed. It named the account as a thing that took and never gave, a hunger kept fed and kept low, and it spoke of the whole apparatus, the doubling and the freeze and the ceiling and the tithe, as a single working built to keep that hunger asleep. A harvest that fed a sleeping thing, she read, kept its crop small and even on purpose, because the thing below woke to size, and a pool that grew large enough drew its attention where a small even crop never did. So the ceiling capped every pool not only to control the inventory, but to keep the largest yield in the realm from ever existing, because the largest yield was the one thing that could wake what slept below. I had thought the ceiling a cage to keep the strong from rising. It was a lid, kept on a thing that fed below the realm, and the cull was how they kept the lid weighted. Then she stilled the way she did when a reading ran past what she could yet say, and she read me the last line, and the last line was about a valve. The working named one exception to the whole capped and even crop, one pool the harvest had built on purpose to grow without a cap, and it named the purpose of that pool in the bookkeeping of men who managed a hunger. A harvest that feeds a sleeping thing needs more than a lid. It needs a way to vent, because a fed thing grows, and a lid alone will not hold a thing that grows forever. So somewhere in the working, the harvesters had built a single uncapped pool, a release valve, a yield allowed to climb past every cap precisely because a pool large enough was the only thing that could either glut the hunger below into a deeper sleep, or the line went, starve it. One uncapped pool, built on purpose, into the one capped and frozen population the rest of the working existed to keep small. Cheryong read the line and then she stopped reading and she looked at me across the nulled chamber. And she did not have to say the rest, because I had already said it to myself. I was the one uncapped pool, the squaring no harvest should have built, the engine that ran off the edge of any instrument, the anomaly the system had coached me to hide on the first morning instead of correcting. All of it. A machine that erases risers had built the largest riser it would ever make and coached it to hide, and I had carried the wrongness of that since the first morning without a shape to put it in. And the ledger in the auditor vault had just put the shape in front of me. The system had protected its own valve, mercy never entering the calculation. Somewhere in the working that doubled 8 billion and froze them, and capped them and called them to keep a hunger asleep, a hand had built one pool to grow uncapped against the day the lid would not hold. That hand had hidden the pool behind the smallest stamp in the allotment, so that the harvest's own enforcement would not cull the one yield it could not afford to cull. For 5 days I had believed I was a crime the realm wanted erased. The truth ran the other way, that I was a tool the harvest had built, and lost track of, the release valve on a hunger I had not yet been allowed to see. Holding my file in his hand, the chief of the cap auditors was a man whose whole faction existed to keep the lid weighted, hunting the one pool that was built to lift it. I did not let myself reach past that, because reaching past a partial answer is how a man talks himself into a comfort he cannot afford, and the ledger did not give me the rest. It named the under account, and it named the hunger fed below, and it named me the valve built to glut or starve it, and there it stopped, as the auditors stopped their own working at the line where even their bookkeeping went quiet. What slept below the world, what the harvest fed, what a valve like me was built against, the chamber did not say, and I stood in the cold of it with the floor of a partial answer under me, and the rest of it dark below the march as the true figure stayed dark on the faulted display. The harvest went somewhere. Somewhere a hunger was real, and was fed, and was kept asleep by a lid the auditors waited with the cold, and I was the one pool built to lift that lid. Cheryong folded the standing ledgers reading away behind her face at last, and she told me, in the clipped report of an appraiser noting the worst hazard on a roster, that we had what we came for and that we should not be in an auditor vault when the standing eyes turned their watch inward. She was right, and we left the chamber. But I carried the wine out with me into the dead flats, and it sat cold in my chest, no longer a wrongness without a shape. I was the valve. The harvest fed something below, and the system that culled every other riser to keep it fed had built me in secret, to be the one pool that could starve it. I had a place to take what I had learned, because a man who priced tail risk for 11 years does not wait until the catastrophe is on him to buy the shelter. Somewhere in the middle days of the carry, while the broker was still turning my flooded vault cores into clean gold, I had spent a quiet share of the hoard on ground, a hold in the broken country past the last safe zone, where the watch ran thin, and the ceiling's flag ran thinner. I had converted the gold into worked stone, and standing walls the boards merely listed without asking who held them. The place went up as I had priced everything for 11 years, against an outcome I hoped not to need, and I named it nothing out loud, though in my own head I called it Tallyhold, the place the last tally of the world could stand where no instrument read him. It had been an empty insurance until the reckoner faltered. After the reckoner, with my cover burned and the quiet march behind me, it became the only ground in the allotment that was mine. And I went to it from the march because a man who has just read that he is the harvest release valve needs walls that the harvest did not build. It did not stay empty long, and how it filled told me more about the harvest working than the auditor ledger had. The reckoner had read the whole population true over 3 days, and the static masses had read static and been waved through. But the static masses were not the only people the reckoner read. Here and there across the allotment it had read the small honest gaps the crier had described, the E grinding a hair past their stamp, the D who pulled a relic, and where those gaps ran a notch too wide it had flagged them, and the flag was a sentence. These were risers, the realm's word for the crop that had grown a notch too large, and the cull had turned toward them the same bell it turned toward me, because the harvest does not distinguish between the valve it built and the yield that climbed by accident. A pool a notch too large is a pool the lid does not want, and the auditors came for the flagged as they came for everyone the ceiling marked, and the flagged ran, because running was the only move left to a person whose own growth had become the crime. They ran from the safe zones into the broken country, as hunted things run for the edge of the map, and the broken country was where I had built my walls. So they found Tallyhold in ones and twos at first, and then in a thin, steady current. The flagged and the running, people whose only crime was that they had grown, and they found it because a hold that takes in the hunted gets known among the hunted faster than any crier could spread it. I did not turn them away, and I want to be plain about why, because the plain reason is the true one and the noble version is a lie the watch could read off my face. My reason was not that their hunting moved me, though it did, the field of tithe marks out on the march having shown me what the cull was. I sheltered them because a man who has just read that he is the one uncapped pool in a realm built to keep every pool small needs the one thing the harvest forbids, which is other pools growing free. A hold full of risers the auditors cannot read is a hold full of the only allies the valve will ever have. The math worked the way the carry's math had worked, cold and clean under the part of it that was not cold at all. Every riser the auditors meant to cull was a pool the harvest wanted drained, and a pool the harvest wants drained is a pool that has every reason in the realm to stand with the one man built to starve the thing it drains into. I took them in because the arithmetic said take them in, and the arithmetic and the mercy pointed the same way for once, and I did not trouble to separate them. To hold them, I built the way I had built everything since the first morning, with the pool converted into shapes a board could not trace back to the figure behind them. The walls I raised higher and warded with works the auditor's standing eyes would read as deadstone, because deadstone is what the march had taught me an auditor reads past. Its risers I housed and fed out of a hoard that did not run dry, because a pool that squares does not run dry. I converted what they needed into the durable plain assets the brokers' fronts listed as ordinary trade, so that Tallyhold read on every board is a modest holding of no particular size, held by no particular name. The risers themselves I put to the work of the hold, because a sheltered crowd with nothing to do is a crowd that turns on itself. And a hold that runs on the hands of the people it shelters is a hold that does not read as one man's secret kingdom. I did not call it a kingdom, and I did not let them call me lord. A hold was its name, and the man who held it was mine, and I kept the true figure dark behind the lit S, the way I had kept it dark behind the 4. The risers who sheltered under my walls knew me for the 11th S the whole realm now knew, and not one of them knew the pool behind that stamp ran off the edge of any instrument, and the fewer who knew the valve was a valve the longer the lid stayed unsuspecting. It held, for a stretch of bells, the steady hold of a well-priced reserve, and I will not pretend I did not let myself feel the shape of the thing larger than a shelter forming around me. A hold full of the hunted, growing free under walls the harvest could not read, is a seed, and the actuary in me priced the seed the way he priced everything, as the start of the one thing the realm forbade, a pool of pools the ceiling could not cap because it could not find. I did not say that out loud either, but I read the current of risers coming through my gate, and I read the work they put into the walls that sheltered them, and I understood that I was no longer hiding alone with one appraiser at my flank. I had grown, without quite deciding to, the beginnings of the one thing a release valve would need against the day it was asked to starve a hunger, which was a people. Cheryong read the hold once, top to bottom the way she read everything, and what she read in the walls and the warded works and the steady current of the flag she folded away behind her face. She told me only, in the clipped report of an appraiser noting an exposure, that a hold this full was a hold with a great many people in it, and that a great many people was a great many mouths, and that not every mouth a man feeds stays a mouth he can trust. I heard it as the hazard report it was, and I priced it, and I let it sit, because the alternative to a full hold was a hold of one, and a hold of one starves no hunger at all. The exposure she had priced came due the way exposures come due, through the one riser whose fear ran ahead of his sense. He had come in off the flagged current like the rest, a man the reckoner had read a notch too large and the cull had turned toward, and I had housed him and fed him out of the hoard like the rest. Somewhere in the stretch of quiet bells, his fear of the thing hunting him had grown larger than his trust in the walls between him and it. I did not see it happen, because I had not yet learned to read the watchers, and Cheryong could not read every mouth in a full hold at once, and so I learned it the way I learned most things, after the fact, in cold. The man had slipped the hold, gone out through the broken country toward the nearest auditor station, and he had carried the one thing a sheltered riser had to sell that the auditors actually wanted. It was the location of Tallyhold, the hold full of the hunted, the current of flagged pools the cull had been chasing across the broken country and could not find. He had sold the hold for a promise, the only coin the auditors would offer a flagged man, an exemption. His own pool spared the tithe in exchange for the pools of everyone who had sheltered him. The walls that hid him he had traded for a word that he would not be culled, and he had believed the word, because a frightened man believes the thing that saves him. I felt the watch turn toward the hold before any messenger reached me, because Cheryong felt it first and brought it to me the way she brought every hazard, plainly and without comfort. She had been reading the broken country around the hold, the way she read a roster, the standing thinness of the watch out past the walls. In the warded heart of Tallyhold she came to me and told me, in the clipped report she used for the worst of them, that the thinness was gone. The watch past the walls had thickened in a single bell from the standing eyes of emptied land into the moving weight of something sent, and the something sent was reading inward toward the hold and not past it. A location had come to the auditors that they had not had a bell before, she said, and a hold full of flagged pools as the richest take the cull had been offered since the reckoner. The sweep that had been hunting the flagged current across the broken country had just been pointed straight at the walls that hid it. She did not say the word valve, and she did not have to. The man who held my file was about to learn the address of every riser in the realm I had gathered under my own walls, and the sweep that would come for them was a sweep that nulled mana. I was a god whose every weapon was mana, standing in front of the one foe a pool could not touch with a hold full of the hunted at my back, and a trader's bargain already struck somewhere I could not reach. The sweep came on the hold the way the broker had warned me. An auditor sweep comes. Without announcement and without a roster, the moving weight Cheryong had read past the walls, closing the last of the broken country between it and my gate. I had a bell to prepare, and I spent it the only way the quiet march had taught me to spend it. The one lesson the auditor vault had drilled into me was that a god whose every weapon is a pool is a god with nothing in his hands against a foe who nulls pools. And so I did not reach for the pool at all. I reached for the horde. Every weighted line of the anti-audit groundwork the system had named in the vault said the same flat thing, that against an audit a man defends with non-mana means or he does not defend. And Tallyhold had been built out of the horde from its first stone, which meant Tallyhold was already the largest non-mana asset I owned. I had built a shelter without quite knowing I was building a weapon. Now I would fight the sweep with the walls. I walled the hold first, because a wall is the dullest non-mana asset in the realm, and the auditors had built their whole craft against the opposite of dull. Out beyond the gate I converted, well back from where Cheryong read the sweep's leading edge, and I poured the horde into stone, raising the warded walls higher and thicker, throwing up new courses across the approaches, worked rock the boards listed as a holding, and the nulling field read as nothing, because stone carries no pool to taste. A sweep built to null mana arrived at a hold and found, instead of the pool it was sent to drink, a wall it had to climb, and a wall is a thing you climb with your hands and not your audit. The auditors had spent so long certain that power meant a pool that they had forgotten the oldest defense in the realm was a high enough stack of stone. I raised the stack, not with mana the field could taste, but with the horde, the leverage and the standing assets the anti-audit working let me spend, and the sweep's leading edge reached the first new course and had to stop and climb it like men. Then I flooded the approaches, because a wall holds a sweep and a wall alone does not break one. And the conjure surplus the reliquary had taught me was the one mana function the field could not punish, since a thrown away construct is not a pool to null but a thing already discarded. I conjured them by the thousand the way I had conjured them in the cracking dark. Crude expendable constructs poured into every approach the new walls left, made and discarded, let to fail by the hundred across the broken ground in front of the gate. It was a flood of nameless force with no single pool in it large enough for the field to fix on. The sweep waded into a hold, defended by a budget that made no sense for any rank. 1,000 throwaway things between it and the walls, not one of them worth nulling and all of them in the way. Auditors who had come to drink one man's mana found themselves instead bogged in a flood of constructs that cost the man nothing to lose, and cost them every stride to clear. Behind the wall and behind the flood, I put the risers, every flagged pool the hold sheltered, kept back from the field that would null them, sheltered the only way a release valve could shelter the pools the harvest wanted drained. Behind stone and waste the field could not read. Cheryong read the sweep through the whole of it, and her reading was the difference. The way her reading had been the difference at every gate since the first. She stood in the warded heart of the hold, and read the moving weight as it came, and she called the sweep's shape to me before it showed past the walls. Where the leading edge pressed, she read. Where it would try the wall next. Where, once, a flanking arm of it peeled off to find the approach I had left thinnest. I poured the flood thicker there, before the arm arrived, because she had read it coming. On ground where I could not read the foe at all, she read it for both of us. Between her eyes and the horde the hold held, course by course and flood by flood, against a sweep that had come certain it would drink the place dry in a bell. It was in the middle of the holding that she read the thing that turned the defense cold, and she brought it to me plainly because it did not fit behind the appraiser's face. The trader who had sold the hold was with the sweep, she told me, brought along to point out the walls he had bargained away, standing under the promise he had been given, his own pool marked for the exemption he had traded every other pool to buy, and his exemption was not real. She read it off the sweeps working the way she read everything, that the auditors had marked his pool for the tithe with the rest, that the promise of sparing had been the coin they paid a frightened man for a location and nothing more. A riser is harvest no matter who he sells, she said. A pool a notch too large is one the lid does not want whatever bargain its owner thinks he struck. The man had traded the walls that hid him for a word the auditors had never meant to keep, and the sweep he had guided to the hold meant to null him in the same pass it nulled the people he had sold. Because the harvest does not exempt its crop for informing on the rest of the crop. It only takes the rest of the crop sooner. I made the call the way the carry had taught me to make calls, cold and itemized, and I will report it plainly because the noble version is a lie. Saving the trader was beyond my reach, and I did not try. A hold defended by walls and waste against a sweep that nulls mana is a hold with no reach past its own gate, no accident to dress and no architecture to drown the man in. The man was outside the walls among the field that would null him, and going out to him meant taking the risers behind me into the open where the tithe could read them. So I held the wall, and I held the flood, and I kept every pool the hold sheltered behind the stone where the field could not taste them, and I let the law the man had bargained with take the man. He had sold the walls for a word, and the word was empty, and the sweep he had brought to my gate nulled him among the people he had betrayed. I did not spend one stone of the hold's defense to stop it, because the stones were the lives of the risers behind me, and the man had already spent himself. The hold held, its trader did not. The harvest took the pool that had sold the other pools, exactly as it would have taken them, and the only thing his bargain had bought him was being called a bell before the rest, which the sweep failed to manage, because the rest were behind my walls. A function unlocked as the holding crested, the way every function had come when I grew into the need for it, and this one came as the answer to a sweep held off a full hold. My panel named it the Ward Network, and it told me what it was in the flat language the system used for everything. The warded works I had raised piecemeal across Tallyhold, the walls and the standing stone and the non-mana defenses bought from the Horde, could be drawn into a single weave, a network of wards reading as dead stone to any audit and binding the whole hold into one defense no standing eye could see, and no single tithe could null. It was the hold made whole, the scattered stones I had thrown up in a bell, bound into a thing that would hold without my hand on each course. I felt it weave itself through Tallyhold as the sweep broke against it, the first ground in the realm that was wholly mine and wholly unreadable. A hold the harvest could not audit standing finished where an empty insurance had stood a stretch of bells before. The risers were behind it. Out front the flood still churned in the approaches. The walls stood, drawn now into one warded weave, and against them the sweep that had come certain of draining the place dry in a bell, found a hold it could not read, could not null, and could not climb fast enough to matter. And then the sweep pulled back. I felt it go before Charyung called it. The moving weight that had pressed the walls for the better part of a bell easing off the approaches all at once. The constructs in the flood suddenly meeting nothing where there had been a sweep to meet, and for one breath I let myself price it as a thing won. The price was wrong. An auditor sweep does not pull back from a hold it was sent to take because the walls held. It pulls back to make room. Charyung went still in the way. She went still when she read a thing the rest could not, and she read the broken country past the emptying approaches, and she did not give me the report flat this time, because what she read did not fit behind any face she owned. The sweep had cleared the ground rather than failing in going, and a sweep clears the ground for the one man who does not need it. And out past the warded walls, alone across the broken country the constructs had churned to mud. A single figure was walking up to my gate. I read him the way I had read the watch on the quiet march, blind to his pool and reading only the shape, and the shape told me what the appraiser's stillness had already told me. He came without a sweep at his back because a sweep was for a pool that had to be hunted down, and he was not coming to hunt a pool. Nulling one was his errand. The chief of the cap auditors did not bring an army to drink one man's mana, because his whole craft was that one man's mana, however large, was nothing his nulling could not reach, and a sweep at his back would only be more pools for the harvest to mine while he worked. So he had sent the sweep to clear the road, and he was walking up it himself, the survivor of a prior allotment, the man who did not fight a mana count, but ended it. He was the one who had felt the ceiling flag a climber for weeks, and never found him until the reckoner faulted and handed him the file. The man who had claimed my name off the warden's index as his own to pull. Since the first morning he had been a weight I had felt and never seen. Now he was crossing the last of the churned ground to my gate on his own feet, alone, unhurried, the way a man walks to a thing he is certain he can finish. The walls I had raised against the sweep stood between him and a hold full of the hunted. And the walls were stone, and stone does not stop a man who has come to take the mana behind it. Bait Gangdo stopped at the gate of Tallyhold, and looked up at the walls, and at me on them, and I stood over the hold I had held against an army with the one weapon the army could not touch, and looked down at the one man in the realm who had never needed an army at all. Bait Gangdo looked up at me from the churned ground at the foot of the gate, and he did not raise a hand or name himself. The not doing of either was the first thing about him that read as wrong, because every other enemy I had ever stood over had wanted me to know what was coming. He simply stood in the mud the constructs had made of the approach, a spare gray man with nothing in his hands, and he let the quiet settle over the walls as the deadness had settled over the quiet march. Behind me, ranged along the inner courses where I had kept them out of the field, the risers of Tallyhold watched him as the hunted watch what has finally caught up. Every flagged pool among them gone still on the stone, and I felt their stillness press at my back. I had held the walls against a sweep for the better part of a bell with stone, with waste, with an appraiser's eyes, and the sweep had read as a thing I could fight, courses to raise and floods to pour, and a moving weight Charyong could call out for me. Looking down at the one man who had come up the cleared road on his own feet, I understood that the fight I had just won had been the easy one. He spoke first, and he spoke as the system spoke, flat and unhurried, reading an entry off a ledger he had read 1,000 times before. Without raising his voice past the carrying of it, he told me that he was the auditor of record on the file marked uncountable, that the file had stood open on the warden's index since the reckoner faulted, and that he had come to close it. There was no name he gave me, not the one on the registry, and not the 11th S, because to a man whose whole craft was the nulling of pools, the name and the stamp were not the thing he had come for. The pool was the thing. He told me that the decree permitted growth to his stamp, and no further, that I had grown past every stamp it kept, and that the correction for growth past a stamp was the tithe. There was no threat anywhere in it. A man does not threaten a sum he is about to subtract. I priced him the only way the quiet march had taught me to price him, which was as a foe my entire power meant nothing to, and I made myself hold the price cold while every faction of me wanted to flinch from it. The thing over my head was a pool that ran off the edge of any instrument, a figure the reckoner had faulted on, the largest violation of the ceiling ever logged. I had spent the bell before this one learning all over again how worthless it was, because the wedge had opened the auditor vault and the pool had not. Here was the lesson walking up to my gate in person. Every enemy I had ever put down, the husks and the sieve, the drowned wardens, the reliquary warden I had buried under 1,000 constructs, all of them had answered to the figure in the end. Had a body it could break or a flood it could drown them in. Gangto answered to nothing the pool could do, because the pool was exactly what he had come to take, and a god holding a weapon his enemy eats for breakfast is a god holding nothing at all. He laid his correction on me without a gesture, and that was the part I had not been able to price down no matter how I turned it. That the worst thing the decree could do to me arrived with no violence in it at all. I had braced for a blow, some reaching weight I could throw stone in front of, and what came instead was a subtraction. It started at the top of the pool, where the figure ran past every rank with no threshold above it to name, and it drew the figure down. I felt the squaring engine that had run uncapped since the first morning meet a hand that did not try to match it or outgrow it or break it, a hand that simply took it. It took the pool as the march had taken the reach I poured into the auditor lock, as the field of tithe marks took the pools of every riser null down to a clean 0 before me. The number that no instrument could write started, for the first time since the first dawn, to come down. It came down fast, and I will report it plainly because the dressing up of it is a thing I cannot afford even now. The uncountable figure, the one followed by a tail of digits the panel itself had always declined to print, dropped place by place as the reckoner's display had climbed, only backward and faster. Its tail of digits shortened, the rank line beside it redrawing itself from past S, with no threshold above it, down through the threshold it had once cleared in a single night. I had crossed S on the 4th morning and never looked back at the ladder, and now the ladder came back up under me from above, the figure falling past the apex, past the floor where the 10 stood, past 1,000,000, past 100,000. The digits the machine had faulted on peeled away one after another, while the man at my gate stood in the mud and did nothing a body could read. Down through the thousands the pool went, the deep E I had been on the second night, the 16 of the first, the engine I had priced as unstoppable unspooling under a subtraction it had no answer for. The risers behind me made the sound a held breath makes when it finally goes, because they were watching the 11th S, the uncountable, the man whose walls had held off a sweep, drained on his own gate by a spare gray figure who had not so much as lifted an arm. I heard the stillness break into the low noise of people understanding that the thing they had run to was being unmade in front of them, and under the noise I read my own panel, because an actuary reads the figure to the end, even when the figure is his own ruin. The pool fell past 4, the public floor, the most boring number in the allotment, the stamp I had hidden behind for 5 days. It did not stop at 4. Down through the last of itself the figure went, as water finds the bottom of a drain, and the private line that had read a figure too long to print since the 4th morning printed, for the first time in the history of my own panel, a clean and final 0. 0. I stood on the wall of the hold I had built against the harvest, and read the one number I had never once seen beside my own name. The squaring engine that had carried me off the bottom of the world was silent, the pool nulled, the figure gone, a god subtracted down to the floor, and then threw it to nothing at all. For the length of that reading I was what the first morning had stamped me and worse, a 0 under the floor of the 4, the dead weight made literal. I stood on a high stone wall with no mana in me at all, a hold full of the hunted at my back looking to me to be strong. Out past the gate the constructs of the flood had already begun to fail, without a pool to sustain them, the 1,000 throwaway things I had poured into the approaches going still and crumbling in the mud. Because conjure surplus is a mana function and the mana was gone. The walls still stood because the walls were stone and stone needs no pool to hold anyone out. But the walls were anti-audit, the horde, the one defense the tithe could not drink, and the man at my gate had not come to fight the walls. He had come to fight me, and he had won the fight I could not win, the fight over the pool, before either of us had moved a stride. Reading the 0 was a thing he let me do. That was the cruelty in him. If a man who only subtracts can be said to have cruelty, that he stood in the churned mud and gave me the time to watch my own figure reach the bottom and stay there. Because the tithe is not a thing done in an instant to be argued with after. It is a correction held in place. I felt the nulling settle and hold, the hand on the drained pool keeping it drained, no squaring at the next dawn and no thread of the engine left to reach for, as the auditor lock had held the reach I poured into it and never let go. Cherion, in the warded heart of the hold behind me, had gone still in the manner that came over her when a reading ran past saying, I did not have to turn to know what she was reading. The 11th S with a 0 where the uncountable figure had stood. The valve drained on its own gate by the man whose whole faction existed to keep the lid weighted. The risers read it as the end. I read it as the end too. For one cold breath, the part of me that had been weak my whole life standing on a wall with nothing in its hands, in front of the one man in the realm who had never needed an army. Then the part of me that had cracked an auditor vault with a wedge while the pool sat useless in my chest told the rest of me to stop reading the number that was gone and start reading the man who had taken it. Gangto stood in the mud below the gate with my whole pool subtracted into his under account, certain with the flat certainty of a man who has finished a sum, and his certainty was built on a single thing, the same single thing the lock in the Quiet March had been built on. He had come to take the pool because the pool was the whole of what a man like me was. A god is his mana and nothing else, and a god with his mana nulled to zero is a corpse that has not yet been told. Every riser he had ever tithed had been exactly that, a pool and nothing behind it, drained and ended in the same pass. He had walked up my road alone, because he had no reason in the realm to imagine that the man on the wall was anything but the largest pool he had ever been sent to drink. And a drunk pool does not fight back. I read his certainty as I had read the captains who counted me 4. Drained on my own wall with the hunted at my back, I understood that the chief of the cap auditors had just made the same mistake every party captain in the sieve had made, the only mistake that had ever mattered. He had counted the pool and called it the man. I had spent the hoard on this exact morning without knowing it was this morning, as I had spent 11 years pricing catastrophes for other people before the realm priced one for me. While I wore the 4 and carried other men's bags and let the whole realm agree I was poor, the broker had been moving cores and relics through a dozen fronts and turning them into clean gold. That gold I had been turning, quietly, into the one kind of thing the anti-audit working named non-mana means, force that carried no pool for a nulling field to taste. A god whose every weapon was mana had bought, while pretending to own nothing, an armory of weapons that were not mana at all. The walls of Tallyhold were the largest of them. They were not the only ones. So when Gangdo started up the road toward the gate, certain his drained pool was a finished sum, I came down off the wall to meet him, and I came down with my hands full of the things the horde had bought against precisely a man who nulls mana. The first was simple, a thrown thing. A sealed alchemical flask the broker had sourced from a realmsmith who worked in reagents instead of cores, the kind of charge that holds its violence in chemistry and not in a pool. I threw it ahead of me as I dropped from the inner course, and it broke against the stone at Gangto's feet and went up in a hard chemical bloom, heat and force with no mana anywhere in it. Nothing for his field to reach into and null. He had not braced for it because someone whose enemies are all pools does not brace for chemistry, and the bloom caught him across the side and turned him. And for the first time since he had walked up my road, the spare gray certainty went out of his face. Recovery came to him as it comes to a survivor of a prior allotment, fast and without panic, his hand coming up to null the thing that had struck him, and his nulling closed on nothing, because there was nothing in the chemical bloom for it to close on. I watched him reach for a pool in the strike and find none, and I read the exact moment the wrongness of it reached him, the moment a man who has spent his life certain that all force is mana meets a force that is not. It cost him a stride. A stride is a thing I had learned to build a kill out of in the flooded vaults, and I built one now, not with the pool I no longer had, but with the leverage the wedge had taught me. I had a bar in my other hand, plain hardened iron the broker had listed as scrap, the same dull mechanical leverage that had cracked the auditor lock. While his nulling was still grasping at a chemical strike that held no pool, I closed the stride his recovery had cost him, and put the bar into him with the whole weight of a body that, drained or not, the squaring had built into something hard across the shoulders. Before Gangto ever took the figure away, the bar landed, and it landed as iron lands, not as mana, and there was nothing in it for him to null. I felt the impact go up the bar into my arms as the loading bar's impact had gone into them the first morning in the sieve. A real weight, a true strike from a true tool. The chief of the cap auditors took it across the guard. He got up a half beat late and went back a full stride through the churned mud. It was not a killing blow, and I had not built it to be one, because a man does not kill the survivor of a prior allotment with a single bar to the guard. What it was a wound. He came up off the stride with a line of red at his temple, where the bar had skipped the guard and found the bone. The spare gray face marked for the first time, and I read in the marking of it, a thing I do not think the realm had read in a long age. An auditor had taken a wound. The man whose craft was that no pool could touch him had been touched, not by a pool, because a pool he ate, but by a thrown flask and an iron bar, and an enemy who had planned for exactly the nulling. A riser on the inner wall behind me made the sound that does the work the narration will not do. A sharp broken cry of a man who had watched the 11th S drain to zero a breath before, and now watched the spare gray figure who drained him bleed. I heard it land down the line of them, the held silence of the hold breaking into the noise of people understanding that the thing they had counted as the end was not the end, that the man on the wall with no mana in him had just put a mark on the one foe a pool could not touch. One of them called it out, in the cracked voice of a man who needed to say it aloud to believe it, that the auditor was bleeding, that the chief of the cap auditors was bleeding in the mud of the approach, with no pool spent against him. I did not turn to them, and I did not let the cry move my hands off the work, because anyone who stops to be praised in front of a wounded Gangto is the one who hands the wound back. But I let it stand on the record, as I had let the dumb luck face stand on the record in the sieve. They had run to a hold that was supposed to be the end of running, and the man who held it had just drawn blood from the harvest. Gangto touched the line of red at his temple, read his own fingers, and the spare certainty did not come back into his face as it had after the flask. Because a wound is not something a man can tell himself he imagined. His eyes went to the bar in my hand, and the broken flask at his feet, and the marks they had made on a body that annulled the entire pool behind them. I watched him price me over again from the start, as Chair Young had priced me in the market square, top to bottom, reading past the drained figure to the thing the drained figure had not stopped being. He had come up my road certain he was closing a file on a pool. Now, in the mud, with his own blood on his fingers, he understood that he had walked up to a man who had spent the whole of a hidden fortune on the single contingency of the day his pool was taken from him. Every weapon in my hands had been built against exactly the foe now standing in front of me. I pressed it, because the one thing the carry had taught me past everything else was that a foe who is recalculating is a foe who is not yet acting, and a half beat of recalculation is the whole of what a kill is built from. So I went at him with the bar and the flasks and the dull plain leverage the horde had bought. No mana anywhere in any of it. A man fighting a god killer with chemistry, with iron, with the patient force of a wedge driven into a seam. He met me as the survivor of a prior allotment meets a thing he has finally understood. No longer reaching to null a pool that was not there, but fighting with his hands and his body as men fought before the realm taught them all to be pools. It was a real fight, the first real fight I had been in since the first morning, because every fight before it I had won with a fraction of a number too large to lose. This one I had to win with my hands and the things I had paid for, against a man whose hands had survived an allotment before this one. He was good. Old, spare, the practice good of a man who had lived through the thing that killed everyone around him. That was Gangto in a fight. But he had built his whole long life on the certainty that the dangerous thing in any room was the pool. And I had built mine, these last bells, on the one truth that unmade his, that against the man who nulls mana the only weapon that reaches him is the weapon that was never mana to begin with.